Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20528 in the name of Sarah Boyack on investing in our future. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press their request to speak buttons now? And I call on Sarah Boyack to speak to and move the motion. Ms Boyack, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Local government is at the heart of our communities and is the key vehicle through which our Parliament supports people in their lives. Our councils deliver the services we all use day in and day out and shape our communities. They are how our communities get to influence the decisions that matter throughout everybody's lives, from nursery to work, our environment and for care and support. So it is disappointing to see the Scottish Government deleting all of our motion, where we identify the raft of issues where local government is crucial, and refusing to acknowledge that cuts have been disproportionately passed on to our councils. Over the last few weeks, we have been working with and listening to our local government colleagues in COSLA, who are clear that the Scottish Government needs to provide fair funding settlements to local authorities and IGBs. A fair settlement is one where local authorities are not forced yet again to go through the vital services they provide and find what the Scottish Government refers to as efficiency savings, but which are in reality cuts. A fair settlement is a settlement where the true cost of national, centrally decided policy commitments made by the Scottish Government, yet delivered through local government, is included in the full funding local government receives. And it's one where due consideration is given to the long-term impact of inadequate funding on local services on the people and the communities we and our councillor colleagues represent. We all know that without adequate funding, that local authorities are forced not just to cut back on services such as community services, libraries, fixing potholes, but it means that they increasingly have to charge for services, and that hits those on the lowest incomes hardest. Briefly, yes.
John Mason. Can I just say, Mr Mason, before you start, there is time in hand, so don't worry yourself about interventions, so that goes for the whole chamber. Mr Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. Is she basically arguing that the NHS has had too much money in recent years and local government not enough?
Ms Boyack.
No, and I would recommend that the member looks at the official report for the Local Government and Communities Committee, where members across the parties talk about preventative spend, which is not just money for local government, but it's also about a joined-up approach which enables people to be cared for by local government to avoid going into the NHS in the first place. Our local government in Scotland is as diverse as the communities it serves, but every council has to deliver the education our young people need. But the ring fencing in the Scottish Government's budget leaves very little scope for the differing educational needs of our communities to be reflected in our schools. No, not yet, thank you. And while teachers' wages are rightly increasing, local government is facing an insurmountable challenge to ensure that classrooms are adequately staffed, not just with teachers, but with classroom assistants and other vital support staff. And how can it be right that access to music tuition is increasingly only for those students whose families can afford them? But it's not just through schools that local authorities have the capacity to impact and shape educational opportunities. They also have the power through community investment to enable school students to enjoy and learn about the local environment they live in, to enable them to take part in community projects, and to make sure that we have empowered communities. We've also talked about in our motion the critical issue of transport services. Our local councils provide the day-to-day transport infrastructure we need, but cash-strapped councils are struggling to repair vital infrastructure, and the climate emergency means that we urgently need to rethink how we do transport, with more bus and active travel commuting options. But the Scottish Government's ring-fencing of funding has meant that as councils grapple with tough decisions, that means non-core funded services get cut. Whether it's having to decide to leave a pothole for an extra 6 months, or decide against making crucial improvement to transport links, these are the realities of day-to-day cuts in our council budgets. Now, just to give an example of to where we need to go, Labour amendments in the Transport Act that were supported enable our authorities to run and invest their own bus services. But that needs new investment, new skills, new capital to invest in buses. And for councils to own and operate their local bus services, it would be a win-win across the country. You just need to look at services in my own area. Affordable public transport people could rely on, enabling an increase in low-carbon bus use. vital to meeting the government's own ambitious climate targets. Now, dignity is crucial. We've said that, dignity and independence for people. The European Charter highlights as its first fundamental right the right to dignity, and that should be respected and protected. And when you translate that from aspirational politics into day-to-day reality, again, it's local government who are responsible for upholding this right. But what does it mean? It's the ability to live independently in your own home and know you'll be looked after when you need it. And it's local government, again, responsible for supporting you to do this throughout your life, whether through social care, by ensuring the infrastructure you need to work for other activities is there when you're working, or making the best of slash budgets to look after you while you're at school. Respecting and protecting dignity through adequate service provision at the local level is also vital to long-term planning. And to pick up the point of John Mason, by investing in social care, local authorities are not just supporting people as individuals, they are relieving the burden on the NHS and enabling people to live at home as long as they can do that safely. And yet in 2018 to 19, delayed discharges cost the NHS £129 million. And that means that it's hampering local government's ability to carry out preventative spending tasks. Yes, sorry, who was wanting to intervene?
Gillian Martin.
I'm very grateful for Sarah Boyack taking my intervention. Everything that she has described seems eminently desirable. Does that mean that Labour is going to bring forward an alternative budget that's going to put forward how we actually are going to pay for all of the asks in her speech?
Ms Boyack.
Well, I think we're all very keen to see the budget as well. And in fact, one of the key issues here is looking not just to the future, but reflecting on the past. And this government should and could have done much better. Let's just take the issue of making homes accessible for those whose care needs have changed. The Scottish Government is wasting vital healthcare money that could be spent better, that we would see instant impact on our communities. And if you look at Oxfam's report this week, it highlights the issue of poverty and the huge number of people acting as unpaid carers. And the Scottish Government's own estimates are that almost half of carers, 45% in the most deprived areas of our country, care for people for 35 hours a week or more, almost double the level in the least deprived areas. And that's not even going into life expectancy, which in the city we're in at the moment, there's over a 20-year gap from the people who are best off and the people who are least well off. And local government is crucial in tackling the key issues we will face now and in the future, whether it's tackling the drugs death epidemic or fighting climate change. But that needs leadership, investment, staff with new skills and knowledge. And I'm sure the Scottish Government would acknowledge that. In the Scottish Government, there's another challenge. But for local government, in the evidence session we had to our committee, Unison said to us, over the past 10 years, there's been a growing crisis in terms of experience and skills in local authorities. 1 in 7 local authority workers has left employment since the beginning of austerity. So I am not just blaming the SNP government. There are others in this room who could be lobbying for more money as well. And there's another budget yet to come. That would be helpful to all of us. But people who've become old enough to withdraw their pensions, I'm going back to the Unison statement, have been offered voluntary redundancy. They've left local authorities, so there has been an experience gap or an experience brain drain, and that is a direct result of the cuts. Now, without the funding to ensure the numbers of adequately trained staff are in place, how does the Scottish Government expect these issues to be tackled on a local level by local government? By disproportionately cutting local government funding, the SNP government has been making a false economy, one which was seeing us stagnate in Scotland and is impacting on local economies throughout the country. Now, local government cannot continue to address challenges while it is facing disproportionate levels of public sector cuts from the Scottish Government. In real terms, budgets have fallen 7% between 2013-14 and 2019-20, and that's compared to the 2% of cuts experienced by the Scottish Government over the same period. So delighted to take an intervention.
Tom Arthur.
Thank you very much. The member has on several occasions said that there has been a disproportionate cut to local government budgets. The corollary of that is that there has been a disproportionate uplift to other portfolio budgets. Can the member outline what other budgets she thinks should be decreased and these resources be transferred to local government, or, if it's not a question of rebudgeting, is it taxation, and what the Labour Party's taxation policies are? I ask in all sincerity, I want to hear some proposals and policies.
Ms Boyack.
Absolutely. Well, we wouldn't be throwing money into preparing for a second Indie Riff, that's for sure. Our stats. If we're going to empower local communities, let us start with our local councils let's start now.
Excuse me, I can't hear anything and I want to hear the debate, so let's hear. Ms Boyack, please.
Being a valued and essential partner is utterly meaningless if proper, fair funding is not addressed. And to pick up on that very last point, we have yet to see the progress on the SNP's pledges for an overhaul of our local taxation system. We are happy to sit with the ministers and have the debates. We would prefer to scrap the council tax, replace it with a progressive alternative based on up-to-date valuations, give councils new revenue-raising powers, including land value capture, get on with implementing the tourism tax. I have to say that was one of my bits of unfinished business from the last Scottish Parliament term. In doing so, Labour would be recognising the vital and equal roles local government and our devolved Parliament play in ensuring the people of Scotland get the services they deserve. That is what we are all here for, to represent our constituents, not just in this chamber, but to support our locally elected colleagues in local government. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call Aileen Campbell to speak to and move Amendment 20528.2. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate is important because it does enable us all to have the chance to recognise the importance of local government in supporting our people and our communities. Working with local government, we have jointly articulated the type of country we want Scotland to be, fairer and inclusive with opportunity for all. And that is captured in the National Performance Framework, which focuses on people and the places they live, improving outcomes and well-being for all, but especially for those most disadvantaged in our society. But in securing those shared ambitions, we do face challenge, fiscal, economic, social and political. And that's why working in partnership with local government as the two spheres of governance in Scotland, it will be critical. In a country of 5 million, there is no other way of working, and it's what Campbell Christie challenged us to do in his report nearly 10 years ago. That partnership is critical if we are to empower our communities, deliver on positive outcomes and maximise the impact of our resources. Indeed, today I've just come from Sighthill in Glasgow, which is undergoing the largest regeneration project outside of London. This massive transformation of this area in the north of the city will see new housing and infrastructure driven by massive ambition for the people in place and enabled through partnership by local and national government, among others. Along with investment along the canal, the north of that city will be transformed and shows the positive effect that can be generated through national and local government working together. And while I am the Minister for the Local Government, the impact and reach of what local government supports and brings to our communities is wide and it's varied, and it touches on the portfolios of many of my Cabinet and ministerial colleagues. Indeed, Labour's motion today outlines the ways in which local decisions and government interplays with our day-to-day lives in terms of education, health and social care, transport and the climate emergency. And that is why, as my amendment outlines, and despite Tory austerity and cuts to the Scottish budget, we have endeavoured to be fair in our funding settlements for local government. In 2019-20, we delivered a funding package of £11.2 billion to local government, a real terms increase of more than £310 million. This represents around a 27% share of our overall budget, and during the period of this Parliament, local government has received a cash increase in their overall budget settlements of £862 million, representing a real terms increase of 2.4%. And guided by our commitment to partnership, it is also why new fiscal powers are being transferred to local government as part of the 2019 budget deal.
Graham Simpson.
Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. A report from the Accounts Commission just the other week said that since 2013-14, there's been a real terms reduction to councils in funding of 7.6%. So where's she getting her figures from? Cabinet Secretary.
I would also remind Graham Simpson that if we'd followed his party's budget proposals last year, the South Lanarkshire Council, the council that he was a representative for, would have had £29.9 million less to run the services that he has been a member of. So again, you will take no lessons from the Conservative Party about how we continue to treat local government fairly. And perhaps what we should also think about is how we compare the councils and the way we treat councils in this Parliament compared to other parts of the UK. And when we do compare that, we see that a lot of local governments across England are found struggling. When we compare what I've outlined in to the situation in England, where English councils have faced a cash terms revenue budget reduction of 14.7% between 2013 and 2020, we do get a sense of the level of rightful protection that we have given our local authorities because of the importance they have in terms of delivering for our communities. And that work and that financial support enables us together to work hard for the people of Scotland, addressing the challenges of persistent inequality and climate change and delivering inclusive growth and well-being. Our transformative work to expand the hours of flexible, high-quality childcare provision symbolises the power of partnership working and collective leadership to improve life chances and to invest in our future. And our collective support for children and families continues through the life journey of our young people. Preparing our young people for a rich and fulfilling life is rooted in the education they receive, and we can be proud that spending on education is being prioritised, and school spending per pupil is consistently higher in Scotland than other UK countries. Ensuring that every child, regardless of their background, has every chance to succeed is why we invest to tackle the attainment gap, with Scottish Government and local government investing at record levels in our young people's education.
Alec Rowley.
Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and she's quite right to point out that if we accepted the Tory proposals for budget, that the cuts to public services would be even deeper, and indeed Tory failed austerity plays a big part in this. However, I would question the joined-up working that is not taking place, because if you take Fife, for example, you talk about schools, hundreds of thousands of pounds have been stripped out of every secondary school in the current academic year. That is having a real detrimental impact, and it is, as I see looking at the Finance Minister, it is hundreds of thousands of pounds per secondary school. Class sizes are increasing, class sizes over 30 odd. I should declare an interest, my own granddaughters in a class of around 33. That's just not working, and we're not tackling inequality and poverty while these problems continue to grow in our communities. I accept the financial restraints that you're working under.
Mr. Rowley.
Do you accept that we need to focus more on tackling inequality and poverty by putting resources to local government?
I wish you'd been down. You should have been on the list to speak, unfortunately, but I don't mind because we've got time in hand. Cabinet Secretary.
We absolutely agree that we need to tackle inequality in our country, and that is why we have, as I announced last year, we'll be taking forward the Scottish Child Payment, which will directly put money into the pockets of people who are the most vulnerable. And it's why we have invested £750 million during this Parliament to tackle the attainment gap that will help to ensure that every child has their equal access to succeed. This includes £33 million to support care-experienced children and young people, £120 million pupil equity funding directly to head teachers, and £50 million to continue the Challenge Authorities and schools programmes for a fourth year. Absolutely continuing to invest in helping support the most vulnerable in our society, but as I'll go on to say, we do so with one hand tied behind our back. Our joint partnership and funding approach extends to the learning estate as well. At least one new school project has been delivered in every local authority area. I would assume that includes Fife in Scotland through the joint £1.8 billion Schools for Future investment programme. And the Scottish Government £1.3 billion contribution will see the construction or refurbishment of 117 schools and will benefit over 60,000 pupils by summer 2020. The same shared commitment that we have to delivering for our young people can also be seen in our ambitions for our housing, the biggest investment since devolution, and for health and social care, when in 2019-20 we increased our investment in social care support and integration of health and social care to more than £700 million.
Daniel Johnson.
Would the Minister not reflect on the fact that the LEIP programme is not an investment programme, it's a maintenance programme. Not a single penny goes towards building the schools, simply maintenance. So could she correct the record on that matter?
Cabinet Secretary.
Schools for the future, investment in pupils, investing, making sure that we invest to support the most vulnerable pupils in our country. I think that's a record that we are certainly proud of, and we'll continue to invest in our education. And absolutely, I'm reminded by my colleague of PFI, an utterly failed attempt from Labour to invest in schools across the country, and which we'll continue to have to pay back for generations to come. But we are certainly not complacent, and we need to think to the future. And given we celebrated the 20th anniversary of this Parliament last year, it provided us also with a useful opportunity to think about what next for the governance of Scotland. Where should power lie? How do we empower our communities? And what needs to change to ensure governance in Scotland is fit for purpose for the next 20 years and beyond? That shared endeavour between ourselves and COSLA has also included significant work being done by my colleague Kate Forbes into looking at fiscal empowerment for local government and providing more fiscal autonomy to local government. That commitment can be seen in the changes we're making to the local taxation landscape, giving greater fiscal autonomy to our partners in local authorities. We have the first primary legislation since devolution on non-domestic rates, and our commitment to a package of measures on local taxation, including new tax powers to local authorities, which will be the biggest empowerment of local authorities since devolution, if it is supported by Parliament. But, Presiding Officer, I said at the start of my remarks, all of this partnership work and focus on outcomes and wellbeing faces enormous challenge. Our resources have been constrained by a decade of UK austerity. The UK spending round announcements in September do nothing to reverse that damage. Our discretionary resource budget from the UK Government for 2020-21 will be around 2.8% lower in real terms than it was in 2010. And it is why it is absolutely unacceptable that the UK Government has failed to adequately engage with the Scottish Government in terms of the budget timetable. On top of this, we try to tackle poverty with one hand tied behind our back, I'll remind Mr Rowley, and against a backdrop of callous and cruel social security cuts which stymies our efforts to deliver positive outcomes for the most vulnerable. Analysis published in 2018 found that UK government cuts would reduce social security spend by up to £3.7 billion by 2020-21. These are brutal cuts, and they leave us trying to mitigate the worst impacts of them. Mitigating the bedroom tax, providing crisis grants. But as the UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston said, mitigation comes at a price and it is not sustainable. And that's why when we have this debate about where and what we should spend our money on and how we should ensure positive outcomes in the communities we're all elected to represent and serve, that yes, absolutely hold us to account, scrutinise the choices that we make, but let's not forget the hurt and the pain caused by austerity and welfare reforms. Let's not forget to point the finger of blame where it needs to land, fairly and squarely at the UK Government. And let's not forget that if any of the parties,
just closing, Mr Finlay.
That if any of the parties in this chamber and taking part in this debate today want us to make different choices or to want there to be different priorities, then they must be open and they must be honest and point to where we need to shift the spend from. Presiding Officer, today's motion rightly recognises the pivotal role that local government plays in looking after people, looking after our communities and contributing to the well-being of our country. I think that regardless of what party we represent, that local democracy and the importance of that local sphere of government is something that we all agree is important. And we all agree that local government must be supported, and that's why we in this government have continued to treat local government fairly, continue to work in partnership with them to make good on the aspirations and the aims of our national performance framework. So I welcome today's opportunity to illustrate the value we attach to our partners in local government and the chance to outline where we have backed that up with action and investment. Now, I said at COSLA conference a few months ago that regardless of whether you have MSP after your name or councillor before it, that we are all elected to ensure we do our best for the communities we serve. So I hope in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that the debate is constructive, enables thoughtful consideration about service delivery and outcomes, and enables us to focus on ensuring that we can work together hard to embed a positive future for our country.
Move your amendment, please.
And I move the amendment in money.
Thank you. I now call Murdo Fraser to speak to and move amendment 20528.1. Mr Fraser, please. If you take interventions, I will accordingly extend your time.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking the Labour Party for selecting the issue of local government funding for the subject of the debate this afternoon. And it's a very well-timed debate because we now know the Scottish Government are presenting their budget on the 6th of February. And the timing is also very helpful from a Scottish Conservative perspective, given at the weekend we set our own asks to the Scottish Government, our own very reasonable requests to the Scottish Government in relation to the budget coming next year. So good timing for Labour to help us outline these to the Chamber. So let me start by putting this debate in context and reflect some of the comments we already heard from Sarah Boyack. Because it is true that local government has been the whipping boy of SNP budgets over the past decade. Every single local authority across Scotland has seen its budget cut, even though the SNP government has seen increases in its block grant. When we look at the budget for the current year, 2019-20, according to the SPICE briefing, the non-ring-fenced revenue funding available to councils fell by 2.5% in real terms. That's down some £230 million. Now, I know that the Cabinet Secretary will argue that there were additional revenues that came in the form of specific ring-fenced resource grants, and that took the total revenue funding up in real terms. However, these were funding streams that followed specific additional commitments, and this meant that the core sums available to local government to do all the important things they have to do fell in real terms. And that was in a year when the Scottish Government's block grant from Westminster increased. And last year was not untypical, if we look at what went before. According to SPICE, in the period between 2013-2014 and 2018-2019, the local government revenue budget decreased at the rate of 7.5%, in a period when the Scottish Government equivalent budget decreased at just 2.8%. Yes, I will.
Kate Forbes. It's an accepted fact that local government funding forms 27% of Scottish Government budget overall and has done for a number of years. So if he is arguing that local governments are getting less, then I assume he's accepting that his party has severely cut the Scottish Government's budget, if that 27% has remained consistent over the course of the last few years.
Well, of course,
Fraser.
That doesn't give the entire picture, as of course the Finance Minister will understand, because what the Scottish Government does is put extra obligations on local councils during this period that they weren't doing before. So although the level of funding has stayed steady in proportionate terms, there are extra duties and commitments given to local government, for example, on childcare, without properly funding these in addition. So the Finance Minister is not quite correct in her interpretation of what's been happening. And at the same time, as this has all been happening in this period, some councils have seen drastic cuts in their per capita funding, the largest in real terms being for the Western Isles, at £572 per head, and the greatest real terms revenue funding per head reduction for Holy Mainland Authority being Glasgow City, which saw its funding per head reduced by £270. Now, listen with great interest to the picture painted by Aileen Campbell of local government across Scotland. It's a picture, I have to say, that would be unrecognisable to councils and council officers across the country, even those from her own party, who in administration are struggling with having to make budget cuts. And in addition to the cuts in funding, what we've seen is an increase in ring fencing. Sarah Boyack reminded us about this in addition. And those of us who have long memories will recall the historic Concordat, entered into between the SNP and COSLA back in 2007, as part of an initiative to remove ring fencing. And it was held at the time as a great step forward, freeing up local government. But here we are, 13 years on, the historic Concordat is long forgotten. Ring fencing has crept back in, increasing... I will in a second, let me just make my point. Increasing even in the course of the last year from 6.6% of total revenue funding to 12.1%, doubling in the course of 1 year. Although COSLA would put the figure much higher. I'll happily give way again.
Kate Forbes. COSLA have complete autonomy over 92% of their budget this year. Their 8% is ring-fenced. That compares to 25% under the last Labour administration. So we have reduced ring-fencing.
Well, COSLA would give very different figures from the minister, the ones the minister just quoted. But I would say to her, in the past year, the level of ring fencing has doubled. So on this direction of travel, it won't take long to get much up to where it was in 2007. And what that does, increasing ring fencing, is put additional pressure on council services which are not ring fenced. So according to Audit Scotland, council services outside of health, police, early learning and childcare, secondary school attainment, higher education and social security could face a between 1 and 16% real-term reduction in their budgets. And we see the impact of this right across Scotland. We see local authorities having to make tough choices. We see them having to cut services, cut the opening hours of libraries, close schools, reduce teacher numbers, reduce the number of classroom assistants, reduce the grants to important third sector organisations, cut school crossing patrollers. Alec Rowley referred to the situation in 5 schools. That's replicated right across Scotland. We see councils then having to try to raise money in other means, either by raising the council tax by the maximum, I've taken 2 interventions, I want to make some progress if I can. Raising the council tax by the maximum of 4.79%, which 12 councils did last year, or bringing in charges for garden waste collection, or even considering the introduction of the hated car park tax as a result of the SNP's grubby deal with the Green Party last year. And we also see councils raiding their reserves, last year to the tune of £157 million. In the last 3 years, 23 of Scotland's 32 local authorities have drawn from their reserves, and some are simply running out of money. And all these cuts are being made at a time when the Scottish Government's overall budget is going up. They are raiding the budget of local government. So, Presiding Officer, what does this mean for the budget in the coming year, 2020 to 21? What we do know is that the block grant is going to be the highest in a decade. We're expecting at least £1.2 billion in Barnett consequentials due to increased spending on health and education south of the border. According to the Fraser of Allender Institute, we're looking at a 2% real terms increase in the block grant from Westminster. And against that backdrop, there's absolutely no need for either additional tax rises or cuts to local services provided by local councils. At the weekend, we set out our asks to the SNP government in relation to the forthcoming budget. No additional increases in personal taxation, although our preference would be for the gap to narrow. A fundamental review of business rates, and at the very least, the maintenance of existing reliefs, and the reduction of the large business supplement to the rate payable south of the border. And when it comes to spending, we want to see all Barnett consequentials arising from health spending down south applied to the NHS in Scotland, an extra £50 million for the police, and crucially, in the context of this debate, no more real terms cuts to local government core funding. And our ask in relation to local councils reflects what has been demanded by COSLA, at least an inflationally linked increase in the core revenue budget and all new commitments to be fully funded from the centre. That, Presiding Officer, is a realistic ask, it is an affordable ask, and it is the right ask at this time. It is the minimum that our councils require, and it is what is contained in our amendment this afternoon. Presiding Officer, I believe that the approach we are taking is a very reasonable one. For too long, local councils have borne the brunt of cuts from this SNP government. For too long, local government has been treated as a cash cow by this SNP government. It is time that stopped, and with more money in their budget for the coming year, this government has no excuse to make further cuts. And on that basis, I am pleased to support Labour's motion, and I am pleased to move the amendment in my name.
Andy Whiteman, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And Greens welcome this debate on local government. In our view, there remains much work to do to reform how we're governed in Scotland, to ensure that we have strong, autonomous and empowered councils. Now, our amendment wasn't selected, but it covers our key positions, and I particularly draw members' attention to the fact that we call on the Scottish Government and all political parties to redouble their efforts to achieve further fiscal devolution to local government and the replacement of council tax with a modern, sustainable and progressive system of local land and property taxation. Because, Presiding Officer, over the last 20 years, local democracy has not only been neglected, but it's been undermined by successive governments, for example, through the council tax freeze. The failure to strengthen local government has been a source of continual comment by those who've been observing and commenting on the work of this Parliament. Now, in the aftermath of the COSLA's own Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy, I brought a debate to Parliament in November 2016, seeking Parliament's endorsement of the Commission's final report. A commission that included representatives of the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, Labour, SNP and ourselves. The Conservatives lodged a wrecking amendment, and it was passed by the Tories, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats. Presiding Officer, the Parliament does not have a good record in having serious debates about local government, and yet it is obvious that Scotland is not a normal European country in relationship to how we govern ourselves. Local government in Scotland is neither local nor does it govern. Indeed, at the beginning of devolution, we had the Macintosh Commission, which noted in 1999, and I quote, "It could be said that Scotland today simply does not have a system of local government in the sense in which many other countries still do. The 32 councils now existing are, in effect, what in other countries are called county councils or provinces." And COSLA picked this up and said themselves in 2013, Scotland is one of the most centralised countries in Europe. It's no coincidence that our European neighbours are often more successful at improving outcomes and have much greater turnout at elections. We cannot hope to emulate the success of those countries without acknowledging that they have more local councils, local elected councillors represent fewer people, and these councils and their services are constitutionally protected and their funding is secured by law, even with regard to national policy making. And so, for example, whilst we have 32 local authorities, the Netherlands have 408. Norway, with a population similar to ourselves, 428. Belgium, 589. In Germany, there are 11,000 councils at the local tier of governance. And in relationship to fiscal empowerment, only 12% of the funding of Scotland's local authorities is under their own fiscal control. And even that meagre autonomy in relationship to the council tax is compromised by the Tory-style rate capping imposed not by statute, which would be lawful, but by holding councils to ransom, by punishing them if they set council tax rates that do not meet the preferences of Scottish ministers. Now, as members know, if Scotland's fiscal policy in relation to local government were to be in place in many European countries, it would be illegal, as it would violate the varying constitutional protections in place to stop local government interfering in the fiscal affairs of the local state. And that's why Greens are proud to have secured at least a commitment to introduce a fiscal framework for local government. Just as a set of rules now exists between London and Edinburgh governing the financial relationship between the UK and Scottish governments, which provides clarity, certainty, transparency and predictability to the financial arrangements between both, although of course the whole arrangements should be improved, so too should there be a similar framework in place governing the process by which local government finance is agreed. And I too am proud that the Scottish Green Party have over the past 3 years delivered 420 million more for local services in recent years than would otherwise have been the case, protecting libraries, schools and other vital services. Now in contrast, Labour, the Lib Dems and the Tories have postured endlessly but actually delivered nothing. Now, the budgets since 2016 have not been perfect. They weren't green budgets, but they've been vastly improved by our participation in the process. Now, Presiding Officer, today Labour brings a motion to Parliament. It contains nice words, and there's not much with which I disagree, but says substantively nothing. Happy to do so.
Neil Findlay.
The member claims that the Green Party has delivered extra money for local government. Haven't delivered any extra money for local government. There has been cuts year on year, on year, on year. Not a penny extra has been delivered for local government.
Well,
Andy Whiteman.
The local government settlement has been vastly improved by our participation in the budget. I've just said these are not green budgets. These are not the budgets that a green government would pass. But in contrast to Neil Findlay and his party, if they had better offers to put, if they had a better negotiating stance, if they had a proper offer to make in budgets, they never provided it over the last 3 years. And to their credit, at least Murdo Fraser and the Tories are now bringing some proposals this year, which, whilst we don't agree with, we welcome that participation. Now, Labour say they want to see local government empowered, yet the motion fails to reflect this, and the response to giving councils the power to introduce workplace parking levies, for example, suggests they're still unable to move away from centralisation. Now, our amendment made it clear that local government needs both fair funding and fiscal powers. Now, Murdo Fraser's amendment, we don't think is being presented in good faith. If it was, then he and his colleagues would have been at the table over the last 3 years, attempting to negotiate a budget deal. The Conservatives have not treated this budget process seriously over this Parliament, and what they've proposed this year, high taxes and tax cuts, high expenditure and tax cuts, is not credible, and they continue to ignore the climate emergency. Worse than that, they've dubbed our proposals for a climate emergency budget as madcap. Adam Tompkins at the weekend talked about sidelining the ludicrous Greens. And the Tories are refusing to take part in cross-party talks to replace the hated council tax. Now, as for the government's amendment, thanks for the name check, by the way, but we can't support it as it gives misleading figures on what constitutes the local government finances over the past few years. Now, if opposition parties took the budget seriously, they'd be attempting to build on what the Greens have achieved and would have our support in doing so. Thanks, Presiding Officer.
I call Willie Rennie for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to thank Labour also for bringing this debate, the kind of pre-budget warm-up. It's an important part of the budget process because local government, as Sarah Boyack said, delivers the services that communities rely on every day of the week, from early years through to school education, roads, public transport, libraries, sports facilities, the things that we really care about in our communities. The Minister has been rather frustrating today, I have to say, that they just can't simply be straight about the local government finance arrangement. Because the reality from what the Minister said is quite different. We see it daily. We see in our local newspapers the impact of the quite dramatic changes in local government finance that the SNP government have imposed. If you look at the share of the overall budget, the revenue budget, 34.7% in 2013-14 was the local government share. 33% in 19-20, a reduction. And charges are up and services have been cut during that period. If you just take the last year, not just now, if you look at just within the last year, the SNP government say that the budget went up, the revenue budget, by £253 million, went up 1%. That's true. But the commitments that the SNP government made on local government's behalf, which is Murdo Fraser's point, was up £400 million. And the result, therefore, was cuts to the core budget of £147 million. Now, the budget goes up, but commitments go up, so therefore there's a cut to the ordinary things that I've just listed that local government does. So why on earth can't the government just be straight with people about, not just now, why the government can't be straight with local government? I will come to the Minister in a second once I've finished making my point. It is important that they are straight with people about the promises that they make, the funding that they provide, and the gap that's there in between. You can't simply take the credit for the extra commitments that you make on behalf of local government and then blame local government for the cuts that they're resulting in as a result of their budget. That simply is not honest with people, and it's not honest with local government. I'll take the Minister's intervention.
Kate Forbes.
Willie Rennie, and of course all these commitments are done in collaboration with local government. But in the spirit of being straight, my question to Lib Dems is what is their number one ask for this year's budget and what would it cost?
Willie Rennie.
My number one ask is that the government actually follows through on the promises that it made to the people of Scotland and provide local government with the money that they promised. These were not our promises. These were not our promises. These were the SNP government's promises. Half of the ask that COSLA is making, the £1 billion that COSLA is making, half of that is just to meet the promises that the SNP government say that they have made on behalf of local government. So just meet that, not just now, just meet that for a start would be a help. And that accounts for half of it. 2% inflation. Now, that doesn't seem a radical proposal from COSLA, £200 million. To make up for the damage of recent budgets, which I've just pointed out, the 34.7% to 33% over in recent years. Repair some of that damage, not all of it, just some of it. That's £308 million. Add that together, £1 billion. That's just to stand still. That's not a massive expansion of local government finance, just to stand still. All that local government is asking is that the SNP government promise and deliver. Not just promise and fail to deliver and expect local government to pick up the tab, but promise and deliver. Because look at some of the things. They're good things, not just how. They're good things. Counselling in schools for mental health, excellent. Pay for it. It's a pure promise, pay for it. Carers Act, certainly not. £147 million worth of real cuts last year. £400 million worth of commitments last year. £253 million increase. That's the problem. The teacher's pension, promise it, deliver it. Additional needs support, promise it, deliver it. Teacher's policy intervention, promise it, deliver it. And then early years, something I strongly support, promise it, deliver it. Don't just expect local government to pick up the tab for the promises you make. You're happy to take the credit for these things. If you're happy to take the credit, promise and deliver as well. What would also help is if the SNP government was to give a clear indication to local government as to what they were expected to do on the council tax. Now, there was a clear indication last year about the cap. There needs to be a clear indication this year so that local government can plan. They need to know when this clarity is going to come, what it is actually going to be. Is there going to be a cap, or are local government going to get the proper freedom to take the decisions, to increase the tax if they want to, reduce it if they want to? That should be their choice. They should be able to take the political flack that comes from it rather than being imposed by the SNP government. And multi-year budgets, something that we all aspire to have, something the SNP government say they would love to have. We do not have the multi-year budgets, the certainty, the kind of forward look so that they can plan for the future. If we're expecting local government to deliver long-term sustainable solutions rather than the short-termism that they're forced to use now as a result of the SNP government's approach to local government financing, then we need that long-term budget process. And then we also need that freedom. Some of the stuff that Andy Whiteman was talking about, having a proper fiscal framework, local government, so they've got some kind of certainty. But the most important thing that the SNP government needs to do is to follow through on the promises that it has made on behalf of local government, rather than expecting them to pick up the tab and make the cuts. Because sure enough, we know from this chamber, from the ministers on the front bench, as soon as there's any cuts in any council in any part of the country, of course it's their fault, not the SNP's fault. Well, live up to your responsibilities, follow through on your promises, and make sure your promises are funded properly. Thank you.
Move now to the open debate, and if speeches of 6 minutes, please. I've got a wee bit of time in hand for any interventions. So Ian Gray, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When it comes to investing in our future, there really cannot be any investment more important than the education of our children and grandchildren. They are, of course, the future in and of themselves, but it will also be up to them that we look to shape that future and to equip them with the knowledge and skills they will need to do that to the best of their ability is surely an imperative intergenerational responsibility that we must shoulder. It's not just about the jobs they will do, although it is about that. It is about creating a generation of fully engaged and empowered citizens, even learning to respect our planet and to respond to the climate emergency in a way which our past generations have clearly failed to do. Now, the delivery of school education is, of course, one which we devolve to our local authorities, and it becomes thereby the greatest responsibility that they have, the biggest of all locally delivered services, commanding over £5 billion of their resources and serving almost 700,000 pupils. And it is right that our schools be organised and funded locally, because local councils are by far best placed to understand the needs and realities of the communities our schools serve. In my own constituency, for example, I have one primary school of over 1,000 pupils, and only a couple of miles away, another, which when I last looked, had 25 pupils. Both are critical to the health, viability and sustainability of their towns and communities that they serve. But the idea that anyone not based in East Lothian would understand exactly what their very different needs are is ridiculous. So with schools commanding such a significant proportion of council's expenditure, then, Presiding Officer, as night follows day, if council budgets are cut, schools will hurt. And they have. As we've heard, councils have faced reductions in their budget, several times proportionately more than anything faced by ministers in their budget, and the results can readily be seen in schools. The amount we spend each year on primary pupils has fallen by £427 per head since 2010. In secondary schools, spending per pupil is down by £209 per head. There are still 2,853 fewer teachers in our schools than we had 13 years ago. And not surprisingly then, the pupil-teacher ratio is higher than it was then, and the average primary class is 23.5 pupils, up from 22.8, and with many primary pupils, as Mr Rowley said, in classes of 30 or even above. Teachers have not just seen their teaching colleagues vanish either. Surely.
Aileen Campbell.
It'd be interesting for context to recognise that while he has painted a very gloomy picture around education, that school spending per pupil was £6,571 in Scotland compared to £5,994 in England, that we have 7,495 teachers for every 100,000 pupils compared to 5,545 in England or 5,038 in Labour-run Wales. Would he not concede that there is a wider context to this?
Ian Gray.
Frankly, if the best the Minister can do is to say it's a bit less bad than it is in England. And perhaps that's why our councils are in the problems that they face. Yes, teachers have not just seen other teachers vanish either. Cuts have hit their support staff too. Take science technicians, for example, crucial for the teaching of critical practical STEM subjects. 333, fewer of them in our schools, almost a 30% cut in 10 years. And perhaps worst of all, while the proportion of pupils with identified additional support needs has reached an all-time high of 31%, numbers of specialist ASN teachers fell to the lowest level ever. Presiding Officer, Murdo Fraser is right. One of the loudest complaints we hear from COSLA is the extensive ring fencing by the Scottish Government of much of the resource councils do receive. Something, of course, which he was also right about, that when the SNP minister responsible was one John Swinney, he used to boast that he would not do. He would not ring fence funds. Now, of course, that Mr Swinney is Education Secretary, he has presided over many millions of pounds of ring-fenced resources in the shape of the Attainment Challenge funding and the Pupil Equity Fund, referred to indeed by the Cabinet Secretary in her opening. Of course, we support the objective of that funding to provide additional support for those pupils who face barriers to educational achievement. But the key word is additional. The deployment of funding to close the attainment gap at exactly the moment when Council's core funding is being slashed could only ever undermine its additionality. And in all practical terms, it is clear that much of it has been used to plug gaps. Indeed, if we look at the 9 Attainment Challenge authorities who received the largest share of this funding, then we find that between 2010-11 and 2017-18, there was an average real terms cut of £406 for every child in primary school and £209 for every pupil in secondary school. The additional funding has not mitigated the effect of cuts to core funding. Presiding Officer, there are educational, pedagogic and curricular issues in our schools. Falling pass rates, national testing, narrowing curriculum. And they must be debated. They are debated in opposition time, albeit since the government refused to bring debates about schools to this chamber, and they must be addressed. But the truth is that this government's central failure in schools is the failure to get the financial fundamentals right, to ensure that our schools have enough teachers with enough support and enough resources to do the best job possible that they can for our children and grandchildren. That would be investing in our future. But to do it, we must have fair funding for local councils and the critical local services they provide.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Graham Simpson.
Presiding Officer, and as a member of the Local Government and Communities Committee, I am pleased to speak today when we will no doubt rehearse many of the arguments that will come forward during the progress of the Scottish Budget. We all agree that local government is hugely important when it comes to the delivery of essential public services across Scotland, and that those services are under strain. So I thank Labour for bringing this debate to the Chamber. However, they're on rocky ground in criticising the SNP government, given their own record whilst in office here in Scotland and currently in Wales. Scotland's 2019-20 resource grant is now 9% smaller than it was a decade ago when the last UK Labour government began austerity with a £500 million cut to Scotland's budget. Who doesn't recall Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling's warning in 2010 that Labour government cuts, if they were re-elected, would be, and I quote, deeper and tougher than Margaret Thatcher's? The Tories themselves continued austerity when they came into power in 2010, supported by Lib Dems desperate for office, although the Coalition's initial cut to Scotland's capital allocation of 36% was less than Mr Darling's planned 40%. More recently, if we look at the 7-year time period Sarah Boyack focuses on in her motion, excluding health, Scotland's resource budget has fallen by 7.8%. So the 7% fall in the local government budget shows how Scottish ministers have tried to protect it and shows that budget reductions are not just proportionate in that context. Of course, some of us recall 2007 when Labour and Wendy Alexander's infamous Hungry Caterpillar speech called for 3% cuts to local government budgets year on year. Ms Boyack was part of the Labour front bench which supported that view. Indeed, Ms Alexander was elected Labour leader a year later, unopposed, a clear indication of support for our policies. Pressures on devolved matters such as health and well-being and social care are rising with a ageing population, leading to an increase in health spending to over 43% of Holyrood's budget, having been around a third at the start of devolution. This is while health resource consequentials were cut by £55 million in 2019-20. Each year, the Scottish Government has to do progressively more with less. Despite the aforementioned trend, the SNP Government managed to increase funding for councils by £310 million to £11.2 billion, a 3.1% cash increase on the year before. Meanwhile, over the last 7 years, mentioned in the motion, the Tories cut English council budgets by 22.8%, driving some of their own councils, such as Surrey and Northamptonshire, to bankruptcy, while in Wales, Labour cut local authority budgets by 11.5%, and indeed Pembrokeshire was also driven to near bankruptcy. In my own area of North Ayrshire, the SNP Government has allocated capital and resource totalling, in a second, 8.3% more in 2019-20 when the previous year, over the previous year, including attainment funding and pupil equity funding. Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
If there's all this generosity coming from the Scottish Government, I wonder if Mr Gibson can tell us why 100 organisations in Glasgow face closure because of the council's refusal to fund them.
Kenneth Gibson.
You've actually mentioned Glasgow, because I was a councillor in Glasgow when Labour cut 9% from the city budget, 167 million and put, in a single year, and put 3,000 workers on the dole. For the Labour Party, it's the singer, not the song, that seems to matter. They only resent cuts when they actually are not the ones implementing them, it seems. And Mr Finlay, you would do better to listen to the answer to a question you have actually asked. It's a bit silly to actually heckle the answer to a question you've asked. How are you going to actually hear what I've said? To continue, of course, North Ayrshire would have had more to spend on services if it was not for Labour's cynical PFI policy, a financial disaster that landed us with a huge debt by building 4 schools at an £81 million construction cost, repayments totalling an eye-watering £401 million over 30 years to 2037, after which the schools will not even be owned by the council. As a result, North Ayrshire Council continues to make progressively higher payments of over £1 million a month, money that could and should be invested in local services. And to add insult to injury, in 2014, Labour Council leaders suggested allocating £5.1 million a year less to North Ayrshire Council in favour of Glasgow, a decision they later hastily rescinded. In 2017, North Ayrshires Minority Labour administration wanted to borrow £72 million, not to enhance capital infrastructure, build a new school or fix potholes, but to buy a 47-year-old shopping centre in Irvine, oblivious to the ongoing decline in retail. And in 2018, their administration suggested hiking council tax across every single band by 12.5% in one go. With the reality bearing no resemblance to rhetoric, it's no wonder Labour support has fallen in North Ayrshire to less than 14%. Now, today ring fencing has been mentioned, and this was a favourite policy of the Labour Lib Dem Scottish Executive from 2007, such that when the SNP came to office, it amounted to £2.7 billion a year in 60 separate local authority budget lines. The now legendary historic concordat between local government and the SNP government scrapped ring fencing, but has now reappeared to the tune of £900 million. It's now a third of what it was under Lib Lab Executive, but it's causing consternation for those with short memories. Of course, the reason for its reintroduction is that when ministers gave additional funding to deliver specific policies, such as maintaining teacher numbers, some councils ignored the policy and spent it elsewhere. Their party colleagues would then attack the SNP government for not maintaining teacher numbers. Such ring fencing as does occur is to deliver agreed policies through partnership working, such as providing 1,140 hours of free childcare from August. Are opposition members seriously suggesting we end up with a patchwork of early years services in order for the local authorities to spend elsewhere? When they give evidence to committee on the local government budget every year, I ask witnesses more or less the same questions. If local government is to receive additional funding, from where should it come? The NHS, other areas of the Scottish budget, increased taxes? If the latter, who should pay and how much? We are occasionally told that local government needs a basket of additional powers, yet there is real reticence about what they should be and who should pay more. And as we know, even when parties suggest new powers, such as workplace parking charges, as Labour did in Edinburgh and Glasgow, they are not above denouncing the Scottish Government if it introduces them. So there's nothing easier in politics than saying we need more money for health, justice, transport, or indeed local government. To be taken seriously, the advocates of more must say how much more, where and who it should come from. Sadly, I've heard nothing of that today, Presiding Officer. The budget statement is still 15 days away, so there is still time for the opposition parties to present some concrete funded ideas ran through its annual Oliver Twist. Please, sir, can I have some more impression? Lastly, no opposition spokesperson has yet suggested how local authorities will benefit from the impact of the Greens Amendment 9 to the Non-Domestic Rate Scotland Bill passed at Stage 2, which will cost up to £308 million in reliefs. And in North Ayrshire, 3,040 properties will lose out unless at least one opposition party sees sense, backs the SNP government and reverses its position at Stage 3 of the NDR Bill, ensuring that those businesses can survive and thrive in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Graham Simpson, followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, we're just a couple of weeks away now from the latest budget, the latest charade where the Finance Secretary moans about his lot, the latest kick in the teeth for local government, with SNP backbenchers and frontbenchers screaming, "Nothing to see here, Gov, it's a fair deal." The latest dance with Patrick Harvey, or perhaps not, maybe it'll be Mr Fraser this time. Labour are right to bring this debate to the Chamber, and we've already had excellent contributions from Sarah Boyack and Ian Gray. Local government has been the poor relation of the public sector under the SNP, and that's a little bit bizarre because the Finance Secretary's local government background is unquestionably solid. He knows better than anyone what councils do, and he should know that they need to be properly funded. The recent Accounts Commission report, which I mentioned earlier, should have made sobering reading for the SNP. Scottish Government revenue funding remains the most significant source of income, and this increased by 1.1% in cash terms in 2018-19, a 0.7% decrease in real terms. And since 2013-14, Scottish Government funding to councils has reduced by 7.6% in real terms. And the Cabinet Secretary couldn't answer that point when I asked her earlier. Councils are increasingly drawing on their revenue reserves. The net draw on revenue reserves in 2018-19 was £45 million. 23 councils have reduced their general fund reserves over the last 3 years, and there is an increasing proportion of council budgets committed to national policy initiatives. We've heard a lot about that already. This, of course, reduces the flexibility that councils have for deciding how they plan and prioritise the use of funding to respond to local priorities. And there was more worrying news on integrated joint boards. This is now an annual event. A majority of IJBs struggled to achieve break-even in 2018-19, either recording a deficit or relying on additional funding from partners. Around a third of the IJBs failed to agree a budget with their partners for the start of the 2019-20 financial year. Extraordinary stuff. Medium-term financial planning is improving, but no IJB had a financial plan that extended for more than 5 years. And over a third of IJB senior staff have changed during 2018-19. Now, COSLA have said that the well-being of our citizens is at risk in this year's budget. COSLA's resource spokesperson, my good friend, Councillor Gail McGregor, said, quotes, "Well-being is about much more than investing in the NHS." Yes?
Aileen Campbell.
£500 million, as proposed last year by the Conservatives, was taken out from vital services. How does he think that would have impacted on well-being in the people and communities across the country?
Graham Simpson.
Well, I'm talking about this year's budget, of course, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary getting together with Mr Fraser to discuss his well-reasoned proposals. Now, back to Councillor McGregor. She said, well-being is about much more than investing in the NHS. It's about investing in the wider public health of this country, the everyday services that enhance the lives of individuals, families and communities. Dealing with the consequences of not investing in preventative services will cost much, much more than investing now. And her colleague, COSLA President Alison Everson, said, local government is the sphere of government closest to Scotland's citizens. Sadly, however, whichever way you want to dress it up, the reality is that in recent budgets, the Scottish Government has chosen to overlook the essential services that communities rely on day in and day out. But she's gone further. Last week, she warned that without fair funding, Scottish local government has meant that councils' budgets are at breaking point. And she said, quote, yes.
Kate Forbes.
If we were to do as the member asked, where would we take the money from to put into local authorities?
Graham Simpson.
Well, as Murdo Fraser said earlier, we're going to get far more money from Barnett Consequentials, 1.2 billion, as an embarrassment of riches. There's no need to, there really is no need to increase taxes. You've got the money to help local government. Exactly. Now, Councillor Everson said the cracks are starting to show in every indicator, whether it's economic growth, tackling climate change, well-being or child poverty. Cuts to council budgets will mean targets are missed. This goes well beyond money. This goes to the heart of our communities. We now have a situation where communities are losing their sense of pride as social isolation rises due to community projects and initiatives being cut. We've got an opportunity, Deputy Presiding Officer, to get things right this year. Derek Mackay does not have to No.
Mr Simpson's just closing.
Derek Mackay does not have to pirouette with Patrick. He can impress us all and foxtrot with Fraser. We've asked that local government's cash goes up, and we want councils to be, he likes the idea, Deputy Presiding Officer, and we want councils to be given an extra 10 million to help tackle homelessness. These are reasonable requests. Miss Forbes is still thinking about that very idea.
Yeah,
a reasonable request. They can help cut out the growth deniers in the Greens, the Labour motion, so ably put across by Sarah Boyack, sums things up very well indeed. I think that if anything, more and more is going to be put onto local government in the years ahead, and quite simply, they need the resources to do their job. Thank you.
All parties have had a representative who's gone over time, so if we could be a bit tighter, please. John McAlpine, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a debate about local government ostensibly, but what is not in the motion is just as important, and what is not in the motion is the NHS. It is impossible to have an honest discussion about local government finance without putting it in the context of overall spending, and particularly health spending. The Scottish Government, unlike the Labour Party in Scotland, went to the electorate in 2016 promising above-inflation increases in NHS spending. The local government finance settlement has to be seen in that context. Because the Scottish Government has kept its promise on the NHS while also facing London-imposed cuts to the rest of its budget, one should exclude those above... Yes.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the member for taking intervention? Will you not accept that in terms of preventative care, by not spending on care in local government services, people don't just end up either having to go into hospital or can't leave, costing the NHS an inordinate amount of money, which is really needed on the frontline services I'm sure you support?
John McAlpine.
Well, I think everybody in this Parliament supports preventative care, which is delivered both by the NHS and by local authorities, and that's why we integrated health and social care and have a generous financial package to support that. One should exclude those above inflation increases for the NHS. The Scottish Government's budget between 2013-14, 2019-20 is reduced by 7.8% in real terms. The real terms reduction for local government over the same period is significantly less than that Scottish budget cut as a whole, once you've taken health out of the equation. Although this year there is a 310 million real terms increase for local government. So local government does a very important job, and that's why it continues to receive fair funding. But the only way to substantially further increase the funds allocated to it is to take money away from health. And that would be wrong, because people in Scotland voted for an SNP manifesto pledge in 2016 to increase the health revenue budget by 500 million more than inflation by the end of this Parliament, which means that we will increase it by 2 billion in total. It would be completely wrong to break that promise, and I'm sure the opposition parties would be the first to call us out if we did break that promise to the NHS. It would mean breaking promises such as transforming primary care, increasing the number of GPs and nurses working in our communities, investing £200 million to expand the Golden Jubilee Hospital and to establish 5 elective treatment centres, transform mental health with an additional £150 million and investing £100 million improving the prevention, early diagnosis and treatment of cancer. That's what people voted for in 2016, and if Labour want to cut that NHS allocation and instead give the funding to councils, they should say which NHS improvements they would abandon. Should cancer care be cut for councils? Yes.
Alec Rowley.
For Joe McAlpine taking an intervention. I think she actually hits one of the problems head on, which is that there may well be resources going into the acute side of health, but it's not seeing the transfer into the community care side, and therefore the principle that the Cabinet Secretary talked about, which was preventative, has not worked. We need resources into primary as well as acute.
John McAlpine.
Well, I would just repeat the point that I made in response to his colleague Sarah Boyack. We all support preventative care, and we are investing in preventive care, and I've already just mentioned the £100 million cancer programme, which is obviously a large part of that is preventative care, and we also have integrated health and social care, and there's a generous funding package behind that. I should say at this point that while the NHS is the priority, local government is actually treated far better than elsewhere in the UK. COSLA's Head of Resources, Vicky Bibby, told the Local Government Committee of this Parliament, and I quote, "The situation in England is very different. I do not think that anyone in Scottish local government or the Scottish Government would want to replicate what has happened in a number of councils in England. I am thankful that in Scotland we have taken a quite different approach. We have co-signed the National Performance Framework and we are prioritising inclusive growth." And COSLA's spokesman for Resources, Councillor Gail McGregor, told the same committee, I quote, "It is evident that councils are collapsing in England and Wales. We would absolutely not want that level of cuts to Scottish budgets." Councillor McGregor is speaking for the convention there, of course, not her political party, but it is surely worth pointing out that she was elected as a Scottish Conservative. And when you look at the comparative figures for Scottish councils and their counterparts in England and Wales, Ms Bibby and Councillor McGregor are absolutely correct. The budgets of councils in England are collapsing. In the period 2013 to 2020, which is used in the Labour motion today, Scottish local authorities enjoyed a cash terms revenue budget increase of 3.6% compared to English local authorities who faced a cash terms revenue budget cut of 14.7%. And the real terms cuts to English council budget was an agonising 22.8%, almost 4 times that of Scotland over the same period. Councillor McGregor was absolutely right to warn the Local Government Committee that Tory-run England is not a country we should seek to emulate. And while it is true that Scotland as a whole, including local government, has suffered as a result of Tory cuts, and while it is true that prioritising the NHS despite these cuts has meant pressure on other funding streams, last year the settlement for councils in Scotland was extremely encouraging. The funding package of £11.2 billion for local authorities represented a real terms increase, as I said, of more than £310 million. And that settlement included a number of very exciting initiatives that make a huge difference to people's lives, such as extending free personal care for the under-65s, the ongoing £88 million to maintain the pupil-teacher ratio and the new £50 million town centre fund. Of course, we don't know what the budget is going to be yet. This year's budget process is hamstrung by the UK Government's decision to move the budget date, and perhaps that's what Labour should be attacking. Thank you.
Would members please keep to time now, please? Monica Lennon, followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard a lot in this debate already about the wide range of statutory and lifeline services that local government delivers. Last week, COSLA warned that the well-being of Scotland's citizens is at risk if the government again reduces the settlement to local government. With this warning on health and well-being in mind, I'll use my time today to focus on social care and alcohol and drug services. Last week, I was struck by the words of Dr Donald McCaskill, the Chief Executive of Scottish Care, when he said, "Nothing else we do as a country matters as much as the degree to which we choose to care for the most vulnerable and those who need support. Social care is at the heart of communities, and the Scottish Government is rightly committed to supporting people to stay at home or in a homely setting with maximum independence for as long as possible. The integration of health and social care has long been supported by Scottish Labour, and we recognise the Government's good intentions. However, too many people are waiting too long for a care assessment of their needs, and then a further long wait for a personalised care package to be in place. Stephen Smiley from Unison Social Work Issue Group said last week, the stress on staff, services and their service users is at breaking point. We need significant investment in social work services to avoid a breakdown. This is a grim picture, and as Sarah Boyack highlighted, unpaid carers who are doing their best to support family and friends who would otherwise fall through the cracks are under increasing pressure. Delayed discharge remains a huge challenge for the NHS and is distressing for people and their families. Since November 2014, Scottish Labour analysis shows that over 2.7 million days have been spent in hospital by people who are medically fit to leave. Around 3/4 of delays are linked to social care. That is costing the NHS more than £653 million since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister, so it is a false economy. And despite SNP ministers pledging to abolish delayed discharge, we've ended up with a very expensive, broken promise. Social care should be a priority for this government, for any government, but instead social care has been weakened and the pressure on the wider health service has exacerbated. And this is because there's been a political choice to underfund local government and then to pretend to everyone else that this is fair. Integrating health and social care is the right thing to do, but we are not seeing the progress or pace of change that we need. Audit Scotland tells us this. We all know it. We all see it in our own communities. In South Lanarkshire, a family told me recently of a harrowing 8-week wait they faced for a care package for their loved one, in fact, in the Cabinet Secretary's own constituency. And when people eventually do get the care that they need, it should be care that is provided safely, that there's continuity and that dignity is at the heart. But we're hearing far too many examples and anecdotes of different carers coming and going every day, putting someone to bed at 6 o'clock at night. This is not dignified or person-centred. Social care is a priority for Scottish Labour. That's why we will introduce a Scottish Care Service. I think we all agree that integrating health and social care is the right and the smart thing to do. But this government has botched the policy. They've failed to deliver transformation. They've cut corners on investment and they've failed to plan for the longer term. In my remaining time, I want to make a plea on behalf of everyone in Scotland whose life has been touched in some way by drug and alcohol misuse and has struggled to find help for themselves or their family. There is barely any local service which has been left unscathed by funding pressures, but cuts to alcohol and drug services have had tragic consequences. These services have had real-term budget cuts of millions of pounds in recent years. This has led to a drastic fall in the number of residential rehab beds and a record number of drug deaths. And unfortunately, the latest indication is that those deaths are rising. In Glasgow, a population of 500,000 people, they've been reduced to 14 residential rehab beds. Now, when I recently raised this with the Public Minister on behalf of Favour UK, who've been campaigning, he pointed to, and rightly, a degree of local decision-making. But it should not be left to a postcode lottery of budget cuts to determine a person's right to access treatment. We're talking about people's right to live. So while I'll make some progress, so while there's a forthcoming debate, I believe next week in government time, on these issues, we need to get real about the services that people actually need. I hope soon that we will see safe consumption rooms in Scotland, but let's not just turn around and blame the UK government, because getting the service means that we also have to provide the right wraparound support to ensure that they are as effective as they can be. And to go back to Unison, their recent survey of social work staff, because it's pertinent for social care and for addiction services, social work departments have been hollowed out. And some of the reports from Unison members, 82% say that their workload has got heavier in the last few years, and 90% say they're considering leaving their jobs. This is really, really serious. Presiding Officer, I support this motion because we must invest in communities and in early intervention to give everyone a fair chance and to avoid storing up problems for the future. We must support those who care and are cared for. We can do this by investing fairly in local government.
John Mason, followed by Tom Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And before I start my notes, my speech, I did want to make a couple of comments on preventative spend. I mean, I do agree with Sarah Boyack's argument that we need to invest in preventative spending. However, the challenge, and we looked at this in the Finance Committee in the previous session, was where to disinvest from. Because unless we've got a lot of extra money, you have to take the money away first before you can do the preventative spending. And so effectively, we would have to take money away from A&E to put more into community care, or we'd have to stop building a new prison in order to invest and stop future overcrowding. No, I don't think so. To move on to what I was going to say anyway, having been a local councillor in Glasgow for 10 years, I do feel a strong affinity with and commitment to local government. Most of our councillors are extremely hard-working and deserve our appreciation. It is perhaps not unsurprising that various sectors are arguing that they need more money as we come up to the budget in a few weeks' time. That is not surprising. It is what we expect everyone to do. But my first point would be that finances should not be allocated on the basis of who shouts loudest, nor should be on the basis of those who have the most emotional appeal. We have a responsibility as a Parliament to be allocating funds primarily according to the level of need, and we should be assessing that need as objectively as possible. But some of that, of course, is a matter of judgment. For example, is the NHS or local government more important? That is an impossible question to answer, and really we should not be asking it. These two sectors do different things, sometimes in conjunction with each other. And when you think of the things they both do, both are hugely important. Educating our children on the one hand, but looking after our kids when they are sick on the other. Providing care for our elderly folk in a hospital setting, and providing care for our elderly folk at home or in a care home setting. We cannot say one is more important than the other, yet we do have to allocate resources between them. At least I hope Labour and the other opposition parties will accept that allocating resources in a budget is not an easy or simple process. To stand by and demand more money for local government today, more money for the prison service tomorrow, more for transport the next day, more for the police and the prison service the day after that, is not logical and does not impress the public. Most members of the public live within limited budgets, and they understand that we also have to live within a limited budget. So we can and we should be more honest with the public that the money is not there to do all we would like, and we as a country have to choose our priorities. Yes?
David Stewart.
Also not important that the government raises revenues which is outstanding. The Social Responsibility Levy, which was passed by Parliament, could have raised £150 million if government had the gumption to introduce it.
John Mason.
There are ways of raising more money, and I've said before that I am open to increasing taxation. I think we have to be careful about how big the gap becomes with the UK, but if there's better services, I think that is justified. So I think if there's sensible suggestions, we can be open to that. But we still have to set priorities. Even if there was more tax money, even if there's more coming from Westminster, we have to set priorities. So I have no problem with Labour arguing, as their motion says, for, quote, fair funding settlements to local government, unquote. But I assume they also want fair funding settlements for other sectors. And if Labour feel that local government has not had enough in recent years, perhaps they should be telling us which sector has had too much. Is it the NHS, which is facing rising demand, but has seen its funding more protected for a number of years? And I have to say, I think the Conservative amendment is even less honest. At least Labour in principle, as David Stewart says, would like to raise more tax in order to allow additional expenditure. But we know the Conservatives really want to cut tax, yet their amendment also asks for at least inflationary increases. And I wonder if they can tell us what the block grant is going to be next year. Very quickly, yes.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm very grateful to Ms Mason for giving way. If you followed the briefings from the Fraser of Allender Institute, their assessment is the block grant will increase by 2% in real terms from this year to next. On that basis, there is no need either for tax increases or indeed for cuts in any spending area.
John Mason.
Yes, it would be more helpful if Westminster would tell us what they were going to give us, other than other people estimating. If I can move on to mention Glasgow specifically and the allocation between the councils. Glasgow has traditionally received one of the highest allocations per head amongst the mainland authorities. And that has been because of poverty, poor health, addiction, shorter life expectancy and similar issues. Of course, everyone wants more for their local area, and that is what we expect people to argue for. So usually at this time of year, we hear complaints that some councils are getting less, or at least less per head, than other councils. Of course that is the case. It has to be the case. We must allocate resources between councils based on need, not on giving everyone the same. And again, we as Parliament, together with COSLA, must look at the overall national picture. It would be a dereliction of our duty to give everyone exactly the same. Allocation must be according to need. And I do accept that measuring that need is not easy. We have a formula, it could be improved perhaps, but COSLA has to agree to that. And it's worth noting too, while mentioning Glasgow, that they have extra pressure on its budget because of the equal pay settlement. Maybe we should remember why that happened. Labour has been in power in Glasgow for many, many years, allowed women in a range of jobs to be paid less than men doing equivalent work. Yet Labour fudged and delayed, so the problem multiplied. And it has been the SNP becoming the administration less than 3 years ago who have sorted this out. Finally, can I put in a word for local... I won't get a clap for this one. Can I put in a word for local councillors themselves? As I've said at the beginning, most of them are extremely hardworking, pour themselves into their communities, and I do not think that £17,470 is an adequate salary. I think all parties should agree to look at this at least after May 21. So in conclusion, absolutely, let us support local government, but let's be realistic about how much money we actually have as we go into the budget process. Thank you.
Tom Mason, followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Labour Party raises a very important topic today at a time where the issue of funding settlements are particularly salient. There is a certain amount in today's motion to agree with. It is the case that the council funding has been not kept pace with the increases in the block grant given to the Scottish Government. In fact, every single council has faced unnecessary budget cuts, sometimes well over 3% in the previous financial year. Now, I do have a fair amount of first-hand experience in this, and I remind councillors of my being a councillor in Aberdeen. Coming from the North East, I'm extremely disappointed in how our region has been treated by this Central Belt First government. Our councillors have seen their funding cut at a rate equivalent to £100,000 every single day since 2018-19. They try to make the case that it is someone else's fault. But in reality, the local government revenue budget has been cut by the SNP at a far deeper rate than that of the Scottish Government since 2013. So when ministers and their foot soldiers stand up to portray this as Westminster's fault, it's nothing short of the abdication of their own responsibilities. No. And let us be very... later. And let us be very real about the effect of these cuts. Using Aberdeen as an example, in the last budget we were able to safeguard libraries, community learning centres and school crossing patrols, but some of the alternative suggestions were a staggering 1.8 million cut out of health and social care partnership, for instance. Alternatively, 1.1 million from a blanket 3% increase across the board in all existing charges. I should mention that both these suggestions came from the SNP. Thankfully, we did not take them up on their offer. Now, these are structural changes in local government funding settlement that could help address some of the issues we see today. Ring fencing of Scottish Government initiatives has been identified as the most root cause of many cuts in other areas. I do accept that these are often projects that have to be delivered at the local level, but if Scottish Government is insisting on these ideas, it should take the greater responsibility for funding them. Much is made of the protection of education and care budgets, which is fair enough. But when this comes at the expense of 34% of planning spend, 15% of road spending, and 10% of environmental spending, these need to be rethought about where the money for headline government promises come from. By accepting a fairer share of this responsibility, the Scottish Government should aid the provision of local services across the country. Much has been made of the idea of council tax reform. Now, except there is no single cross-party consensus on the optimal way to address this, but a bit of effort wouldn't hurt. As far as the council tax goes, no one is expecting the SNP to reinvent the wheel or stick to the original manifesto commitment. Chance would be a fine thing, after all. But from the party that promised to scrap the council tax, I think something over and above a toothless commission with no achievements to its name might just be a start. Because currently only options available to struggling councils are cuts, spending reserves or raising taxes. I do think a fair settlement for local government means saying to them, yes, you can have more money, but you have to tax everything from people to parking spaces in order to get it, is equally unacceptable, to force councils to raid their reserves and to make ends meet. In the last 3 years, 23 local authorities have been forced to dip into their savings for day-to-day spending. I'm afraid this is a massive red flag which ministers have either missed or ignored. But I hope that the points raised regarding the very real challenges faced by local authorities will not be unheeded. Ministers have the chance to alleviate some of these pressures in the upcoming budget. Presiding officers, councils and ultimately the people they provide their vital service for need politicians across the board to approach this in a sensible, level-headed way. But I brought to my attention just recently the publication in the Sunday Times, I think it was, that the Wellbeing Index, league table has just been published, and Scotland has fallen down by 5 places into the bottom half, which for me reflects just how bad the SNP government has been handling things. And for our part, that is why we have extended an offer to SNP in order to pass their budget in a couple of weeks without the threat of whatever new taxes the Greens have dreamed up recently. Part of this offer includes significant measures to help grow our economy and expand the tax base, enabling more revenue to be collected without raising rates. But we also want to see the overall funding settlement of local authorities to be addressed directly. By increasing core funding by at least inflation, whilst fully funding all additional commitments, local authorities would be far less reliant on dipping into reserves or cutting services to make ends meet. The Finance Secretary will have a couple of weeks to examine our proposal, and I hope he does so before his own draft budget in early February. Presiding officer, local authorities up and down the country have been consistently telling us that more of the same from the Scottish Government is not the trick anymore. Councils are struggling to make ends meet, and this comes only at the expense of vital frontline services that they do their best to provide. It is not good enough to cut council funding to the bone and blame someone else. It is not good enough to leave councils to decide between spending their savings or cutting posts. There is time and there is the money, and I hope in the budget the Minister will choose to invest the local government and all the good that they can do. Thank you very much.
Point of order, Mr Stevenson.
Would you be minded, Presiding Officer, to provide the 30 seconds necessary for Mr Mason to clarify any further sources of income he has beyond his parliamentary salary?
Which Mr Mason are you referring to?
Who's just sat down.
Could you stand up and clarify that, please?
And Mr Tom Mason, who's just completed his speech.
The short answer to that is no, because it is up to individual members what they wish to declare in the chamber, very often related to the register of interest. I now call James Dornan, followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and just for the record, I've got absolutely nothing to declare. I'd like to think that my speech will be of interest, but I've got nothing to declare. I get in before you, Neil. Can I just say that one of the most disappointing aspects of politics in this place is that parties continue to suggest spending without costings. Honestly, they'll never be seen as serious alternative governments if they continue in that way. And don't get me wrong, I used to be leader of the opposition in Glasgow, and I know how easy it is to stand up, demand everything and ignore cost, and have great fun doing it. Yet I still ensured we always put down a costed alternate budget. And so, until they play their full part in the budget process, this is just grandstanding or carping from the sidelines, No matter how eloquent, as Sarah Boyack most definitely was, no serious proposals, no suggestions about where funding will come from, just a list of wants, which none of us are likely to disagree with the possible exception of the Tories, I suppose. But, Presiding Officer, as we've heard, local government plays a vital role in tackling some of the defining challenges facing Scottish working people. Indeed, as the Labour motion references, our councils can be, and very often are, at the forefront in the fight addressing climate change. Scotland is leading the world in tackling the climate emergency, and Glasgow, as a city, is leading the way in Scotland. Glasgow City Council aim to be the first city in the UK to reach net zero emissions by 2030. And despite what Sarah Boyack suggests, Glasgow has managed to do that as part of this ambitious plan led by City Convener for Sustainability and Carbon Reduction, Councillor Anna Richardson. Glasgow's now entered its second year of the low emissions income zone scheme. So they can do that whilst they're working under what appears to be devastating restrictions, according to some of the other parties. Through the LEZ, at least 40% of bus journeys through the city centre will be required to meet tough emission standards this year. Bus operators have invested in their fleets to ensure they meet the target, with first launching a number of fully electrical buses earlier this month. The city's LEZ aims to have 100% of buses meeting the standard by 2022, and the city gears up to COP26. It's very encouraging to see that collaboration between the government, City Council and transport partners to further incentivise public travel as a convenient and sustainable alternative to the car. And can I suggest that that collaboration is crucial in making sure that we get the best out of every single part of it, local government, national government and any other partners. Presiding Officer, local authorities tell us they want greater responsibility for their own finances and to be less dependent on grants from central government. Both the Tories and Labour have called for more localism and to bring about reforms to make local government more accountable to its local communities. And these calls are perfectly sensible. At a meeting of the Citizens' Assembly on Saturday, Richard Leonard said an issue politicians can and should cooperate on is climate change. However, it's utterly hypocritical and actually makes no sense for Labour to say our councils can be key players in tackling the climate emergency, whilst at the first opportunity they refuse to support the workplace parking levy. Now, the Parliamentary Scottish Labour Party might not support it, but many of their council colleagues across Scotland do. This is a discretionary power now available to our councils, which, amongst a series of other measures, will help to reduce congestion, improve air quality and create a healthier environment. So while they talk a good game about empowering communities, the SNP gets on with the job, delivering the most significant empowerment of local authorities since devolution. Presiding Officer, as we are talking about local government finance, it would be remiss of me not to mention the equal pay issue, but John Mason talked about it in some detail there. Can I just remind that Labour spent £2 million in defending this indefensible pay scheme in court. It's going to cost the SNP administration in Glasgow £548 million. And last year, the Glasgow City Council leader said that it's likely to cost the city about £25 million annually for years to come. So let's not be taken in by words about what you must do. Let's talk about how you get the finances in place. Let's talk about every time you want to give more money to local government, where are you going to get that money from? Because there is nowhere else you're going to get that money from except for the health service. We're talking about the early intervention, which I completely support. But we can't do that. We can't have preventative spend without, as John touched on, taking it from somewhere else. And to do that, we need to have extra money, or else what you're saying is, you know, forget the operations that we're doing, put that money into early intervention and prevention, and we'll see the results in 10 or 15 years' time, whilst at the same time, your granny's not getting her hip operation, and all the other things that you need to get done are not getting done. There has to be realism here. We should be working together on things like this. We shouldn't be trying to play cheap politics on it. And don't get me wrong, I'm pretty good at cheap politics at times as well, I've been told. But this is too serious an issue to play cheap politics on. Now, I see I'm coming at the end of my time. I could talk a wee bit more than this because it's very important to me. You know, we are facing further difficulties this year given the delay to the UK budget caused by our friends, the Tories, which have completely ignored Scotland and the needs of our local authorities to set their budgets for the year ahead. But I go back to my opening comments. There's an onus on every party to act responsibly with regards to next month's budget bill. If you have asks, identify funding. Maybe in future, Labour will work with the Scottish Government instead of holding to that principle that they don't work with us unless they absolutely have to. And remember who really caused the austerity that led to the cuts in Scotland's budget, leading to debates such as this in the first place, and that is the Tories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Dunn. I call Colin Smith to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. COSLA's recent report on the up-and-coming budget Invest in Essential Services needs to act as a wake-up call to this government. The report lays bare the financial crisis facing councils across Scotland who've had to make £2.1 billion worth of cash cuts and savings since 2012. It shows clearly that the debate in our council chambers is not just about which services to trim, it's about what services to scrap altogether. And it highlights the remarkable job our council staff do to keep as many of those services going as possible at a time their resources and their morale are being ground down day in, day out by the tsunami of cuts being inflicted by this government. It's frankly an insult to those hard-working staff who serve our communities every day for the SNP to keep claiming that local government has received a fair settlement when 40,000 jobs have been axed by our councils since 2007. Just as the political choice of austerity by the Tories has been devastating for our communities, so too have the political choices of this SNP government in their budgets. It is an undeniable fact that Tory austerity has meant a 2% cut of funding to the Scottish Government between 2013-14 and 2019-20. But the SNP's budgets have turbocharged that austerity by imposing a 7% cut on our councils. We see the impact of that choice. I'll take an intervention, yeah.
Kate Forbes.
Does the member think that we were right to pass on health consequentials to the health service in full?
Colin Smith.
I do think you were right to do that, but I'll tell you what you were wrong to do. You were wrong to make sure that people on £140,000 last year received a tax cut in your budget. You're wrong to have a private finance initiative that spends £1.4 million a month on the Royal Sick Kids Children's Hospital that isn't even open. And I'll tell you what you're also wrong about. You're going to be wrong in this budget by planning on spending millions of pounds on an independence referendum that nobody wants next year in this country. And we can see the impact of the choices that Kate Forbes and others have made in our communities every single day. I see that in Dumfries and Galloway. Since 2010, the council budget has been cut by 12.6%, compared to a 3.8% reduction in the Scottish Government's own budget in that time. As a result, the council have been forced to make £106 million worth of savings in that time. Every year, it becomes more and more difficult to protect key services. At the end of last year, the council began consulting on the latest unpalatable options from officers for cuts caused by this government. Reducing subject choices at secondary school, cutting roads maintenance and transport budgets, a further fall in library budgets, new restrictions on access to music tuition, changes to social work staffing, which their own report described as high risk, and a 30% cut in support for the region's iconic festivals and event strategy were just a few. If, as the SNP in their motion claim there is a real terms increase in funding for councils, why are their own councillors being forced to consult on cuts like that? Those councillors have had to reduce teaching posts at a time when a third of Scottish children are leaving primary school without the expected literacy and numeracy attainment levels, and they've reduced leisure facilities when a third of Scotland's school children are obese. Yet despite the stark reality, the SNP claim in their amendment to have delivered a real terms increase in funding for councils, knowing full well this funding doesn't scratch the surface of the additional burdens they've imposed on our councils. As the COSLA report shows clearly, the proportion of council budgets ring-fenced for specific government projects has almost doubled since 2013-14, coupled by growing demand. It's limited councils' freedom to invest where they believe it's needed, and it's created a perfect storm when it comes to unprotected areas. One such area is transport. Under the SNP, council transport spend has fallen by a quarter, with both revenue and capital spending on the decline. While in real terms, council funding fell by 7.5% over the past 5 years, the cut in spending on local roads by councils fell by 26%. Last year alone, local government spending on transport was almost £300 million a year lower than it was in 2007-8. That's £300 million less a year spent on maintaining roads, pavements and supporting vital public transport links. No wonder there's a £1.8 billion repairs backlog on our local roads, and no wonder bus passenger numbers have collapsed by over 100 million since 2007. For serious about climate change, we need to get serious about supporting public transport, in particular our bus services. That is key to reducing transport emissions, which continue to be Scotland's most polluting sector. But more than that, supporting bus services is about supporting communities and our economy, connecting people for work, for education, for healthcare and to socialise. Instead of consulting on whether to remove Labour's successful bus pass for older people for anyone aged between 60 and 65, the government should have been consulting on how we can extend that to more younger people. The new Transport Act gives our councils a range of new powers. If you've got to make an intervention, I'm quite happy to take one.
James Dornan.
Did extend the bus pass?
Colin Smith.
It was this government that should be extending it further to young people, starting off by modern apprentices, which they promised to do, and so far they've failed to do. They've also cut the yearly income per journey to our bus companies. That's one of the reasons why, right across Scotland, the bus network has been dismantled route by route under this SNP government. Now, thanks to Labour's amendments, the new Transport Act gives our councils a range of new powers relating to bus services. Crucially, the ability to run services directly or by setting up municipal bus companies. This new power has the potential to transform local bus services, ensuring they are run for the communities they serve and allowing councils to get the best possible value for money by returning profits back to the public purse, not the shareholders of the big bus companies. But as Sarah Boyack highlighted earlier, those powers are meaningless without the resources to meet the upfront cost of setting up those bus services. Reversing plummeting passenger numbers needs the local councils not just to have the powers to run bus services, but the funding to rebuild our fragile bus network. That means, Presiding Officer, the forthcoming budget needs to give those local authorities those resources. It needs to put an end to cuts to councils. It needs to give fair funding to our local councils. The SNP and Greens are good at rhetoric when it comes to ending austerity, but as this debate has shown and the facts expose, they are all talk, and it's our lifeline council services and those who rely on them who are paying the price.
Thank you, Mr Smith. I call Gillian Martin to be followed by Bill Bowman. Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Once again, Labour have put forward a motion that is, in essence, very difficult to argue with. The bulk of the text of the motion outlines the importance of local authorities in delivering on their objectives of preparing our young people for life through local authority-run schools and looking after our elderly population with dignity at its heart. And the motion rightly mentions the importance of local government in helping us to tackle climate change. There won't be a single member that disagrees on the importance of the role local authorities play in many aspects of our constituents' lives and delivering on the national priorities that we decide in here. But then the motion replays the standard Labour tune that we hear week after week in this place, and that's the constant calls for more money to be given from the Scottish Government to whichever public sector organisation has been discussed. It's a line that plays very well. We need more money for our schools, we need more money for our hospitals, we need more money for our councils. And taken individually, these asks are hard for anyone to disagree with. And Mr Finlay, I'm not sure your interventions have actually added much to the debate, so I'm going to decline. Taken individually, these asks are hard for anyone to disagree with, and they generate good press headlines along the lines of Labour calls on Sturgeon to do more for fill in the gap. Sort of thing we'll probably see in the papers tomorrow. But what never happens, not in the time that I've been in here certainly, is one Labour member standing up and telling us where this money should come from. Year after year, Labour fails to put forward their budget proposals to this chamber. Year after year, the Labour leadership declines to meet with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance ahead of the Scottish budget proposals to argue their case. There is a notable exception, of course, of Alec Rowley, who broke the ranks last year and put his asks forward to Derek Mackay, only to be hauled back by Richard Leonard, who I believe has never put an alternative Scottish budget together in all his time as Scottish Labour leader. It's really easy to call for more money. It's really easy to say that local councils need a bigger settlement. But do you know what's hard? One, making sure that our local authorities get an increased settlement with a limited block grant dictated to by another government. Two, protecting Scotland's public services against a backdrop of austerity policies of a Tory government that has undoubtedly impacted on the poverty levels and the well-being of our people, which puts extra strain on those public services. And when we do mitigate, often on a moral basis, that money needs to come from somewhere. So what do we cut to give local authorities more money? Money for early years care expansion, free personal care for the elderly? Do we not go ahead with Frank's Law? Do we bring in tuition fees for our students? And hardest of all for the devolved government is not having the full suite of powers that would enable us to protect us fully from the impact of pernicious Tory policies. Powers like employment law, which I believe Richard Leonard still hasn't agreed to join the First Minister in asking for, despite him getting to his feet practically every week and complaining about some aspect of. Oh yes, Labour like to call for things, but when it comes to actually doing something about it, they're silent. But there are Labour members in amongst that group that are former government ministers who've had to manage budgets in the past, so they know the score. But to my recollection, when Labour was in power, they underinvested in their public services. Sometimes there was unspent money from the block grant that couldn't be rolled over into the next year. Sarah Boyack, I will take an intervention.
Well, absolutely delighted to take an intervention, to give you an intervention. Things like free bus travel, free personal care, yes, introduced under Scottish Labour. And when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, we hugely increased the amount of money available to this Scottish Parliament, and it was spent wisely. And yes, I agree, tough decisions, but David Stewart today mentioned a money-raising job that you could do now. And in my own summing up, I actually specified where we would support more revenue coming to the Scottish Government using the existing powers.
Gillian Martin. I'm delighted to hear that in summing up, Sarah Boyack is actually going to reverse the trend. And I really look forward to us all listening to where the money is going to come from for all the asks she made. I just remember, though, that there was underspend in the past. And no wonder when the SNP came to power, we had to embark on a programme for schools building, investment in new health estate, affordable house building, and improving our transport infrastructure in my area, which was particularly woeful and is only now getting the attention it so badly needs. And I think that when talking about policy and plans, it's entirely reasonable to look at Labour policy in the devolved nations where they do hold power. Labour-controlled Wales has seen 11.5% real terms cut to Welsh local authorities. So, Presiding Officer, we have a budget coming up. Will Labour leaders, including the ones sat behind Sarah Boyack, meet with Derek Mackay with their spending asks, and will they crucially publish a detailed alternative budget that gives the citizens of Scotland Labour finance policy and plans to scrutinise rather than one-note, empty headlines that we've come to expect?
Thank you. Can I call Bill Bowman to be followed by Rona Mackay?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the chance to speak in this debate, Investing in Our Future, and want to thank the Labour Party for bringing it forward for debate today, because the SNP are squeezing councils dry, expecting them to do more with less. Now, I will speak about the North East of Scotland, which is my region. It has had successful investment opportunities in recent years, the V&A in Dundee being one example of them. However, there are also many issues across the region that stem from a lack of local funding due to SNP budget cuts, leaving Scotland's local authorities facing immense pressure. As with so many SNP policies, the North East of Scotland is hit hard. The General Revenue Grant for North East councils, including Angus Council, as my colleague Tom Mason has mentioned, has had a cut at a rate of equivalent of £100,000 a day between 2018-19 and 2019-20. Now, local government is at the centre of our communities. For sustainable and positive change, local authorities must receive a fair funding settlement. However, the Fraser of Allender Institute predicts a total reduction of £1 billion to local government revenue funding between 2016-17 and 2021. There has been positive investment, or have been positive investment opportunities in Dundee and the North East. As mentioned, the V&A in Dundee has had a very positive effect on the city. Its economic impact in Dundee was more than twice that first anticipated, bringing an extra £21 million to Dundee's economy and more than £50 million further afield across Scotland during the 12 months since the museum's September 2018 opening. This extra cash has supported an equivalent of 696 jobs in Dundee and 2,143 across Scotland. While there is obvious praise due for the £80 million museum, criticism has been levelled at the perceived lack of momentum in the wider waterfront regeneration project in Dundee. Against this backdrop of a spate of closures in the city, some local business owners have asked for clarity in the future of the regeneration plans. And it's apparent that Dundee still has many funding issues and needs investment out with the V&A and the waterfront. Now, according to the Dundee City SNP Council leader, Dundee Council is going to face 10 years of catastrophic cuts. He claimed in August 2019 that all services will face cuts of some kind, as they need to come up with £80 million over the next 10 years. He warned that people in all walks of life in Dundee will feel the effects of the cuts the council would be forced to make in the years to come. We have bigger class sizes, closure of leisure centres and libraries, and a reduction in roads and property maintenance, being just some of the drastic plans Dundee City Council chiefs are considering in a bid to balance the books. They need investment funds. There are also important issues in Dundee relating to cuts to funding for alcohol and drug partnerships in Tayside. There are 31 of these ADPs across Scotland, which bring together local partners including health boards, local authorities, police and voluntary agencies. They are responsible for commissioning and developing local strategies for tackling problem alcohol and drug abuse and promoting recovery. However, Scotland now has a higher rate of drug-related deaths than in the USA and in every other EU nation. But in July 2019, it emerged that funding for alcohol and drug partnerships in Tayside had been cut by more than 22% since 2015. Despite ministers acknowledging the region now faces a drugs death emergency. This prompted the Scottish Affairs Committee to accuse the Scottish Government of adding to the crisis in Dundee by cutting their funding. Services in Tayside have had their allocation cut from £5.4 million in 2014-15 to £4.2 million in 2018-19. Across Scotland, the allocation was reduced from a high of £69 million in 2015 to £54 million last year, prompting fears over the provision of vital services. The reduction coincided with a 94% rise in drug-induced deaths, with 1,187 lives lost in 2018 alone. 66 deaths were attributed to this in Dundee. Now, on top of this, and shamefully I have to say, Dundee is now ranked as the worst city in Scotland for females to grow up in. A study by Plan International UK shows the levels of regional inequality that still exist. The report's analysis measured female rights and quality of life using indicators such as child poverty, life expectancy, and their NEET status. That is, not in education, employment, or training. Now, Rose Caldwell, the Chief Executive of Plan International UK, said policies at a national and local level are not going far enough to tackle inequality. However, this again is not possible without adequate funding. The
Cabinet Secretary.
In terms of inequality, would you not concede that when the UK Government wants to reduce social security spending by up to £3.7 billion in Scotland, that has a direct impact on inequality in this country? Would he not demand of his own ministers at Westminster that they reverse some of those cuts?
Yeah. Bill Bowman.
I think you've had long enough to deal with this here. The Scottish Conservatives have set our demands for the upcoming budget. Our primary asks include an inflation-linked increase in the core revenue budget. I can go back and repeat the part. I mean, Dundee being the worst place in the UK for young females to grow up in, I think that is very, very, well, I would hope embarrassing for you. More hospital beds for, as I said, drug addicts and a tax freeze. We do not want to see hard-working Scots footing the bill for the SNP's inability to fund and invest in local government properly. That is why we are rejecting council tax rises, the car park tax and tourist taxes that will see the SNP palm off responsibility in raising the level of funding councils received on to hard-working Scots. An investment in local government is an investment to better the lives of the people of Scotland. Is this too much to ask of the Scottish Government? It seems so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Bowman. And I call Rona Mackay before we move to closing speeches. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in this debate about local government and appreciate the Labour Party bringing it to the Chamber today. We all know that our local authorities are in the front line for providing the day-to-day services everyone relies on. They are a lifeline to our communities. Their hard-working elected members and officers are also in the front line for complaints, often channelled through ourselves as MSPs, as every one of us in the Chamber will recognise. Presiding Officer, councils do face significant challenges year on year, of that there is no doubt. But it's important to recognise these challenges are a direct result of austerity and policies pursued by the Tory government in Westminster. And as others, or some others have said, despite ongoing cuts from Westminster, 7.8% between 2013-14 and 2019-20, the Scottish Government has sought to deliver a fair funding package to local authorities. My own authority, Eastern Bartonshire, received a total of £209 million revenue and capital. And yes, like every other council, they had to make savings of around £6 million. But I'm afraid that's the result of austerity, and there's simply no getting away from it. Notwithstanding, since I was elected at the start of the current parliamentary session in 2016, local government has received a cash increase in its overall budget settlement of £862 million, a real terms increase of 2.4% as a result of the budget agreements between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party. That seems like a reasonable deal to me, delivered against all odds. Now, I'm aware that when some services are cut and savings have to be made, these are just statistics, figures that would appear to have no meaning. But the reality is that there's no pot of gold and we have no choice but to deal with the cards we have. More money for councils would mean a cut to the health budget outlined by Joan McAlpine and others, or the education budget, or many other areas that we desperately need, and which the government has protected and enhanced, and rightly so. And it's, of course, up to each authority how they make the required savings, and this often comes down to priorities. Priorities which all too often the opposition try to blame our government for, when these decisions are completely devolved to individual local authorities. Like my colleague Gillian Martin, I agree with the premise of most of Labour's motion that the Parliament commits to supporting people and communities, that local government has a crucial role in doing this. Everything expressed in Labour's motion is correct, except when it comes to the statistics and the underlying reason for the challenges faced by local authorities. Presiding Officer, I'd be surprised if people didn't recognise that the Scottish Government is getting on with the job of empowering communities in a variety of ways. In fact, our 32 local authorities have received the most significant empowerment since devolution. Some examples are a consultation seeking views on a discretionary local levy on visitors staying overnight or tourist tax, and responses will inform legislation to be introduced in 2020. We've also enabled councillors to introduce a workplace parking levy should they wish to do so. Last week we announced new powers for local authorities to regulate short-term lets where they decide, if they decide this is in the interests of local communities. We will devolve non-domestic rates, empty property to relief to local authorities in time for the re-evaluation in April 2022. If there's agreement on a replacement for the present council tax, we'll publish legislation by the end of this Parliament, with that legislation taken forward in the following Parliament. Our local governance review is considering how power and resources are shared across the public sector and with our communities. We also have agreed to develop a rules-based framework for local government funding in partnership with COSLA, which will be introduced in the next Parliament. Decisions on all future budgets are subject to negotiation with COSLA, so working with local authorities is very much at the top of our agenda. Under this government, ring-fencing of local authority funding has been decreased, giving local authorities complete autonomy to allocate over 92% of the funding the Scottish Government provides. Under the Labour Lib Dem administration, ring-fencing stood at £2.7 billion in 2007 compared to only £0.9 billion under the SNP government. And the ring-fencing that there is relates to policies supported by parties across the chamber, such as the expansion of early learning and childcare and free personal care, two of the most transformative policy initiatives this nation has ever experienced. So let's just emphasise an additional £210 million in revenue and £25 million in capital to support the expansion of early learning and childcare to 1140 hours by 2020. Plus a further £120 million to be transferred from health to local government to support health and social care. Indeed, COSLA representatives themselves have described ring-fence policies such as early learning as excellent and priorities which they support. Of course, we know that this year's budget process has been hampered by the UK government's decision to move the budget date, another example of complete disrespect and disregard for this Parliament. Labour should join the SNP in calling this out rather than engaging in public speculation on the budget. And we know that a massive £125 million was spent on mitigating Westminster Government austerity measures and benefit cuts in 2018-19. Presiding Officer, that's outrageous. That money could alleviate many of the problems faced by councils in maintaining services. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government does support and will continue to support and value local government despite the stranglehold of Westminster austerity.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to closing speeches. I call on Alexander Stewart to wind up for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be able to close this debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservative Unionist Party on funding our local authorities. As someone who served in local government for 18 years as a councillor, I am acutely aware of the importance that is faced upon councils to balance their budgets and ensure they have good finances. Over the past 13 years, the Scottish Government have seen fit to cut local government funding to the bone, especially asking them to do more for less. This is quite simply no longer sustainable a position for councils to be in. In order for our local authorities to continue providing the services on which they rely, it is vital that they receive fair funding settlements in the coming year's budget. Last year, the SNP government cut every single council's budget. This was despite the fact that the block grant increased, with also the local authorities facing a cut of around 3%. The SNP's savage and unnecessary cuts to local government is now not a new phenomenon. While the Scottish Government budget only decreased by 0.8% between 13-14 and 18-19, the SNP chose to reduce council funding as far steeper point as 7.1%. A 7.1% was taken. Yes, I'll happily take an intervention.
Minister Kate Forbes.
The member mentioned 7.1%. Now, of course, when the 2019-20 local government finance settlement was set, excluding health, because there's been agreement that we should pass on health consequentials in full, the Scottish Government's resource budget will be 7.8% lower in real terms in 19-20 compared to 13-14. That is a higher figure than the figure he just shared.
Alexander Stewart.
Not at all. The Barnett consequences are coming up, and you are going to receive hundreds of millions of pounds extra. That is the fact, Minister. Over the course of 5 years alone, the Fraser of Allender Institute predicted that there will be a loss of £1 billion to local government in Scotland. But despite all that, the SNP continue to refuse, as we've just seen, to say there's any problems that are being created by themselves. Ministers have even rejected reports by the Accounts Commission that showed in real terms cuts to council budgets, trying to argue that funding has continued to rise, a point that was very well made by my colleague Graham Simpson. This is wholly unacceptable and ignores the fact that, for example, if a council is asked to increase its budget by £5 million, but then they're asked to fund £10 million of extra additional priorities, that leaves that council £5 million worse off to deliver core services. Between 2018-19 and 19-20 alone, the percentage of revenue funding to support specific Scottish Government policies almost doubled from 6.6% to 12.1%. This putting a real strain on spending outside Scottish Government priorities such as culture and leisure, roads maintenance, environmental services, and this is a disproportionate, and this cannot be allowed to continue, Presiding Officer. Councils are being forced to look at every possible way of addressing this funding situation, with over two-thirds of councils having to be forced to draw down on their reserves, and with 3 years a day-to-day spending. Moray Council has talked about that they're going to have only about 5 years of reserves left if they continue to fund and spend as they are. In places like Clackmannanshire, they're looking to substantially cut public services. Others are looking to consider introducing compulsory redundancy policies, while Highland Council, for example, has had to cut class time for their youngster pupils to save money. This is despite the fact that each and every council has imposed at least a 3% rise on council taxpayers, and with some even going to the maximum of 4.79%. Others are actively considering introducing the car park tax, the tourism tax, which will give them allowance because of the dodgy deal that was done last year with the Greens to support the budget. Despite all those being a part of it, this is a chamber. The council tax has been for growth. The SNP have criticised the current system since they came to power in 2007, set up a commission. And you don't like, as you say, facing the music when we have. Presiding Officer, we have received and heard some very good contributions today, and I pay tribute to Sarah Boyack for bringing this debate today. She talked about local government at the heart of the communities. She talked about the fair system and the true cost. And she even gave an example, and we've all heard it, that access to musician tuition is a real issue across many of our councils. So it's councils that are being hit hard. The Cabinet Secretary herself spoke about local government playing a massive part in its commitments. But it can only do that, Cabinet Secretary, if you fund it to make sure that they can give those commitments to it. Murdo Fraser spoke about the budget cuts being there, and commitments and funding and down, and ring fencing. All of those things are having a detrimental effect on our councils. Will Rennie talked about the commitments, up £400 million by the Scottish Government, but the massive gaps that are there. Cosla talked about councils needing to be supported, but this SNP government do none of that. Graham Simpson's talked about having to the reserves that are being used by councils just to pay the bills and to ensure that they can keep going. And all the issues that GIBs and joint integrated boards are having about the lack of finances, the lack of planning and losing all their staff. So, Presiding Officer, the increases that the UK Government have given will ensure that Barnett consequences will come to Scotland in droves, and this SNP Government will no doubt squander them as they have in the past. We need to see a budget that is properly funded for local government without forcing hard-working Scots to end up paying the bills. This means that councils and capital revenue budgets must increase by at least inflation, and that new additional commitments required by councils must be funded and not asked to pour on to others. Only by doing this will we ensure that local councils are prepared to deliver, and they want to deliver. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am more than happy to support the motion, which includes the amendment proposed in the name of my colleague Murdo Fraser, which seeks to provide a greater clarity what we're doing here. It's time for councils to get a fair deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs Stewart. I call on Kate Forbes to point out for the Government.
Presiding Officer, well, that was a good rehearsal for the budget. And of course, at least we're discussing a budget, which is more than can be said for the UK Government to have delayed it to such an extent that they're still not discussing anything. And of course, it was also a good opportunity for some parties to rehearse their asks, but for most parties to just demonstrate that they've still not figured out what they want in this year's budget, never mind costing it. So Willie Rennie asked me to be straight, but can't himself be straight with the Parliament and the electorate about what he wants to see in this budget. And if he wants to give £1 billion more to local authorities, I'd ask him where he would cut £1 billion. Now, of course, to be fair to the Greens, they have been the only party to date with genuine asks of local authority spend and have actually delivered it. And the nature of compromise, the nature of minority government, is to come to agreement to get a budget through, and not to pick on the Lib Dems. But Willie Rennie also mentioned the need for clarity, and that's rightly so. He asked for clarity on council tax, clarity on multi-year budgets, clarity on funding. Now, I agree that local government needs clarity, and that's why the Scottish Government has brought forward our budget to the 6th of February to give that clarity, despite not having that clarity ourselves, because the UK Government won't be publishing its budget until the very day on which local authorities have to set council tax. I will.
Mike Rumbles.
Today, certainly in the committee this morning, the £100 million of wasted taxpayers' money that the Scottish Government has focused on the Ferguson's fiasco, that's not the only wasted amount of money. There's almost £200 million. If she cares to discuss it later, I can tell her where we could save £200 million like that.
Kate Forbes.
Mr Rumbles for identifying what the Lib Dems' main ask is, which is to ensure that the workforce in Ferguson's don't have a future and the ferries that I need for my constituency aren't built. Now, of course, additional clarity is invaluable for local authorities. We've all agreed on that. They know full well that a deal is needed between the Scottish Government and another party to get the budget through. So anybody who calls for clarity in this chamber and then fails to participate in the budget process has failed local government. And that need for clarity is very relevant to the Tories that have finally woken up to the fact that there is a budget process. Murdo Fraser has identified some intriguing requests. He asks us, for example, to match the income tax rates south of the border. Well, what will they be? We don't know until the 11th of March. He promises that there will be more money to spend next year from the ever-generous UK Government. Alexander Stewart said the money would be coming in droves. How much is it? Well, we won't know for sure until the 11th of March. And he asks us to make changes to non-domestic rates when his party has supported changes to the non-domestic rates bill, which takes away the powers for us to do that. Sarah Boyack started by talking about the need to work with local government, which we do. and we think is important. And in fact, we are in discussions with COSLA as part of the budget process just now. It would, of course, be nice to be in discussions with the Labour Party as well about Labour priorities for this year's budget, what the main ask is and how it will be funded. And I'm looking forward to Sarah Boyack's closing speech, because I'm waiting with bated breath to find out more details about what those are. Sarah Boyack rightly mentioned the importance of preventative spend. And that is all about outcomes. It's about outcomes which are captured in the National Performance Framework, of which we and COSLA are, of course, co-signatories. But Joan McAlpine is quite right. In Labour talking about shifting resource from health to local government, I think all parties in this chamber would be the first in line to complain about cuts to other parts of our budget when it comes to it. And Labour need to identify where those cuts would fall. Gillian Martin's speech was brilliant in laying bare the hypocrisy of when it comes to calling for increased spend in one area, but not being able to say where it would be cut in another area. Now, Joan McAlpine also mentioned other parts of the UK, and that is relevant to this debate because ultimately the source of the majority of our funding goes back to the UK government. English local authorities have seen a real terms reduction of 22.8% over the period 2013 to 2020. Welsh local authorities have seen a real terms reduction of 11.5% over that period as well, which is precisely why COSLA's finance spokesperson said that councils in England and Wales are collapsing, and in Scotland we are taking quite a different approach. But, presiding officer, the key point in all of this is very, very simple. This year, every party currently complaining in the chamber right now has the opportunity to present fully costed proposals to the Finance Secretary as part of the budget process. Every party that fails to do so will have achieved nothing but the party posturing that James Dornan rightly identified. Now, despite the obstacles that we face as a Scottish Government, we remain firmly focused on bringing forward a budget on the 6th of February which delivers on the objectives that we share with our local government partners of improving well-being, supporting inclusive growth, responding to the global climate emergency, tackling child poverty. And all of those are firmly anchored in the jointly agreed National Performance Framework. And so, presiding officer, as I close, our negotiations with local government are ongoing ahead of the budget announcement on the 6th of February. I can assure all members that this government stands ready to work with any opposition party who is willing to act responsibly by bringing forward constructive proposals for the Scottish budget, and I look forward to seeing them.
Thank you very much. And I call on Rhoda Grant to wind up the debate for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We introduced this debate to urge investment in local services, to invest in our future and to build a caring society. After over a decade of austerity, our services that our constituents depend on are broken. There is a waiting list for free personal care, and in some cases it's simply not available. Young people with additional support needs are not receiving the education they're entitled to. Local roads are crumbling, full of potholes, and bus services are being cut. COSLA's campaign, Investing in Essential Services, highlights that local government is at breaking point and cannot take continued cuts to their budget. And that's why we are calling on the Scottish Government to invest in local government and give them a fair funding settlement. We need to draw the line. And from the tone of most of the thoughtful interventions to this debate today, I think we all know that is true from our mailboxes. Sarah Boyack, in her opening statement, talked about dignity, and that runs through this debate. Monica Lennon pointed out that ISD figures since November 14 costed delayed discharge at £653 million. That is a false economy. Nearly over 2.5 million days of people's lives spent in hospital that they didn't need to. This impacts on real people. I have a constituent who faced Christmas in hospital. She was fit to go home, but needed additional support in the short term. She'd done nothing wrong, but was yet about to be held in hospital against her will. We were able to intervene and get support for her, but how many other people spent this Christmas in hospital when they should have been at home with their loved ones? Looking after people at home is a fraction of the cost of holding them in hospital against their will. We have to invest in home care, to value those that provide the service and to allow people to remain at home in comfort. I have another constituent who has been told he faces spending the rest of his life in a care home because community care can't be provided. It's simply cruel. His partner is going to have to give up work to look after him at home for as long as possible. And this is a fundamental breach of the promises this government made to carers in the Carers Act. And it will cost much more to look after him there than it would have been at home, where he wants to be, at home with his family. Monica Lennon talked about the pressure this puts on social workers, with 90% of them contemplating leaving the service. And Graham Simpson talked about IJBs who are in deficits because the costs are falling to them and then in turn to NHS boards and councils. Monica Lennon and Bill Bowman also talked about drug and alcohol services. Cuts in those services are leading to deaths. We have increased drug deaths, and that is simply unsustainable and in a caring society. Ian Gray, in his contribution, talked about investing in our children and grandchildren. Young people with ASN are not getting the education they are entitled to, and there is no support for their parents. I have pupils who have to share ASN teachers, but they're not even on the same class. So one child does without support, while the ASN support goes to the other class. I have parents who can't get to work because school continually calls them in to look after those children. We're not only failing those children, we're failing their classmates and their families. Falling teacher numbers, growing class sizes is a failure on all of us. Cuts in music tuition, meaning only those that can afford music tuition are now being able to learn a musical instrument. And after-school clubs are disappearing. Colin Smith talked about transport, and he talked about bus services. We all know Lothian buses as an exemplar, and we would want that kind of bus service for all our communities to be rolled out. We need to invest in bus services, but instead, council cuts are actually meaning that bus services are taken away because councils cannot afford to subsidise them. And he was perfectly right in saying, instead of questioning the older people's bus pass, the government should have been consulting on how to keep it and indeed extend it to younger people, because we need to rebuild our bus services.
Could members keep the noise down, please? Thank you.
And, Presiding Officer, this has a cost to the economy of all our local economies. If 1 in 7 local government workers have left their work, if 40,000 jobs have been lost in any other employment, there would have been a pace, there would have been an outcry, and people would have dealt with those job cuts, whereas they disappear under the radar when we are talking about local government. Andy Whiteman talked about devolution and the transferring of powers. Devolution means transferring powers, yes, from London to Edinburgh, but surely, yes, from Edinburgh to our communities. And he was right to quote COSLA in declaring that this is the most centralised country in Europe. We must ensure that powers are entrusted to our local councils, but that they have powers over their own taxation and indeed the service they provide to their own communities. The voluntary sector too is facing cuts because of the cuts to local government. We heard about the situation in Glasgow, but that is being replicated throughout the whole country. Presiding Officer, we know that tough funding decisions had to be made, but letting councils bear the brunt of that has led to increased pressures and costs elsewhere. Cuts to community care have increased disproportionately, putting stress on our acute care services. People are ending up in hospital and remaining there because there's no support in their community, and that costs much, much more to the public purse, and the personal cost to those involved is immeasurable. Failing to provide our young people with adequate education has a lifelong cost for them, but to all of us, because if we lose their contribution, had they met their full potential, and it must change. I believe that there is nobody in this chamber that has entered politics to preside over this, and therefore we need to look after our people, and we need to provide fair funding for our councils to enable them to do that.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate on investing in our future. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 20546 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No one has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 20546 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Thank you. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 20545, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, on the extension of a Stage 1 timetable for a bill. Can I ask Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no member again has indicated they wish to speak. The question, therefore, is that motion 20545 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to decision time. The first question is that Amendment 20528.2 in the name of Aileen Campbell, which seeks to amend motion 20528 in the name of Sarah Boyack on investing in our future, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Or not agreed? We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20528.2 in the name of Aileen Campbell is yes 61, no 61. There were no abstentions. And yes, as is usual in these cases, as Parliament has not made up its mind, I will vote against the amendment and I will not make up Parliament's mind for it. So I vote against the amendment. The amendment is not agreed. The next question is that Amendment 20528.1 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Sarah Boyack, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to the division and members may cast their votes now. Number 20528.1 in the name of Murdo Fraser is yes 55, no 61. There were 6 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question this afternoon is that motion 20528 in the name of Sarah Boyack on investing in our future be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20528 in the name of Sarah Boyack is yes 55, no 61. There were 6 abstentions. The motion is therefore not agreed. And that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Jeremy Balfour on the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh 350th anniversary. But we'll just have a short pause while members and ministers change seats. A short pause.